This is the close on Bloomberg, monitoring developments right now at the U.S.-Canadian border. This is on the northeast portion of the United States, the border with Canada, the Rainbow Bridge, a popular crossing to get across into the Niagara Falls region, either on the U.S. side or the Canadian side, that is now closed. In fact, all border crossings in the Niagara region have been closed at this point as authorities on both the U.S. and the Canadian side investigate a car that was seen on fire on that bridge. Now, we do not know the cause of that fire and what is actually behind it here. But the governor here in the state of New York, Kathy Hochul, as well as authorities on the Canadian side, saying they are looking into the matter. But for the time being, right now, all traffic has been halted in both directions along that passing, as well as perpendicular passings there in the Niagara region. Romaine, Bostick here alongside Katie Greifeld. We are kicking you off to the close here in the U.S. on what is supposed to be one of the busiest days of travel of the year, as a lot of people take off for the Thanksgiving holidays here in the U.S. And of course, Canada has their own observances here. But just a reminder, I think once again, Katie, that we still live in somewhat trepidous times, and things like this have to be taken seriously.
And of course, this is a developing story. We don't have many details yet. Of course, you laid out most of them. We do know that law enforcement on the scene is placing those canine officers, those dogs, on each of the international bridges in the area as a precautionary measure after this incident in particular. Of course, the FBI on the scene as well, trying to determine the cause, what's going on here. Sarah McGregor, who helps lead our national coverage here in the U.S. and a former bureau chief for one of our Bloomberg offices in Canada, is joining us right now to talk a little bit more about this. And Sarah, without getting too deep into speculation, let's just start off, first of all, as to how these events unfolded, at least as to what we know publicly.
Yes. So as you're saying, this is still a breaking news situation. Probably about an hour ago, we were hearing the first reports that there had been an explosion at the Rainbow Bridge. It's the bridge that connects Canada and the U.S. You can actually see from the bridge the tourist site, Niagara Falls. And we know that the car was going from Canada into the U.S., at least that's what officials are telling us right now, when it exploded. Again, I think just with the seriousness of the reaction to this, we have people like the Ontario Premier speaking out, Chuck Schumer, Kathy Hochul. I mean, you can definitely see with the FBI investigation and local state officials being mobilized on the scene that this is being taken as a very serious event. We really still have to hear details. Was this intentional? Was it accidental? Was anyone hurt? Were there casualties? We don't have that kind of information yet. The situation's still very fluid. And Sarah, given that we don't have a lot of details at this moment, tell us a bit about this actual crossing, the Rainbow Bridge. There were about 90,000 crossings into the U.S. at that bridge last month. Just put it into context for us, how important this crossing is. Yes. So unlike some other crossings between the U.S. and Canada, this isn't a huge trade one. There's a pedestrian aspect to it. Pedestrians can cross this bridge. Cars do cross it to go from Niagara Falls, Canada to Niagara Falls, USA. It's quite a picturesque place. And I think, it's hard to say right now exactly, I guess, what the repercussions will be. Again, as you said, with the Thanksgiving weekend, it's Thanksgiving in the U.S., but not Canada. But it is a busy travel day. So there are some reports, which we have not confirmed yet, that other bridges on the U.S.-Canada border nearby have been shut down. So this could have some huge repercussions for travel and for trade, at least temporarily.
Sarah McGregor, who leads our national coverage here on the U.S. side of that border. Let's go now to the other side of that border in Canada, where John Ehrlichman is joining us, anchor over at BNN, who was just getting off the air a few minutes ago, helping to break this news for us a while ago. John, what do we know about the Canadian response right now to this incident?
Well, certainly authorities here, Romaine, are being notified of the situation right now. You'd been recapping some of what we've heard from New York's Governor Kathy Hochul, as this is a very fluid situation, in the words from the FBI field office in the Buffalo area. I can tell you that in the province of Ontario, which of course shares that border with New York State, the Premier, Doug Ford, our colleagues have confirmed he's been made aware of the situation. And that provincial law enforcement locally is assessing this situation. There are a number of videos being shared locally about some of the impacted roadways. So as you had been highlighting at the top of the hour, aside from the authorities that are already on the ground at the Rainbow Bridge, we are seeing other bridges affected and some of the travel routes in and around there affected, because this is that point when you don't know what you don't know and you're trying to gather and assess the situation.
Well, give us a sense here of what we do know about the closures right now. I mean, overall, between the entire length of the border between the U.S. and Canada, I think there's something like 21 bridges and tunnels, and I think 6 or 7 of them are in that general Niagara region. We know the Rainbow Bridge has been shut down. Have those others also in the Niagara region also been shut down completely in both directions?
We did see the Niagara Falls Bridge Commission report that all 4 of its crossings, now the other ones, Romaine, would be in Lewiston, Whirlpool, and Peace Bridge, that those were closed. The other thing that obviously we're trying to figure out is, at the end of the day, at this vehicle checkpoint, what exactly was hiring. There's been a lot of focus on some of the video emerging on social media, videos showing that the fire was in a U.S. Customs and Border Protection area just east of the main vehicle checkpoint. Again, we're going through all this information as we monitor the situation, but you had a lot of photos and video that was coming from bystanders that was posted online that was showing a thick smoke, flames on the pavement, and then a security booth that had been singed by the flames. And so with that blast that we saw, obviously you saw quick action taken to not just monitor the situation, but to restrict movement in those areas as a precaution. So to see those other crossings impacted, given the situation and the immediacy of the need to get some answers, probably not a surprise, Romaine, but we are still waiting for more details, obviously, on how long that lasts. And of course, this is coming, as you already mentioned, at a very busy travel time for folks as we head into the Thanksgiving weekend, and at a location that already between our two nations is an extremely busy travel point.
Well, John, talk to us a little bit more about that. Of course, like you said, this is a developing situation. We're waiting for details. We'll bring those to you when we have them. But talk about, this is the eve of Thanksgiving. This is a very popular border crossing. What do we typically see when it comes to travel ahead of the Thanksgiving holiday?
Well, certainly around the border crossings themselves, let's not forget that while sure you could see people from, let's say, Canada making their way to the United States, oftentimes around the border crossings, you do have a lot of local traffic from people who may end up working on both sides of the border. And the fact that it's happening at a time when we are seeing so many people traveling speaks to, obviously, the uncertainty of the situation right now. I will note that there were some comments coming from the Buffalo and Fort Erie Public Bridge Authority, some comments that they made to ABC News about all those 4 bridges connecting the two countries being closed. So going back to what Romaine was talking about just before we started talking about the actual level of activity, Romaine. And we should probably also note that when it comes to trying to figure out the why at this point, the cause of the incident was not immediately clear. The governor, Kathy Hochul, who you mentioned some of the comments from her already, certainly monitoring the situation and all those points of entry.
Yeah, we just showed her recent social media posts on that. And while we don't know the cause, we should point out, as the governor has said there, John, is right now all points of entry into New York are now being monitored by the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. And presumably, I would think other points of entry into the U.S. should be as well, given that we're on the precipice of one of the busiest travel weekends of all year. We'll catch up with you again soon, I'm sure, John, hopefully under better circumstances. John Ehrlichman there over at BNN Bloomberg, and our thanks to Sarah McGregor as well here at Bloomberg News. Stick with us. We're going to get back to our markets coverage coming up after the break. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the close here. Monitoring the situation at the New York-Canadian border. This is one of the major border crossings here in the northeast part of the United States. We're now learning that most of those border crossings have now been closed. This is after an incident along the Rainbow Bridge that connects Niagara Falls on both the U.S. side and the Canadian side. There was reports of an explosion and a car on fire. We don't necessarily know the cause just yet, but the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, did put out a social media post saying that the Joint Terrorism Task Force at the FBI here in the U.S. was investigating the incident and, as a precaution, is now stepping up its oversight of all of the boarding crossings from Canada into New York, as well as other parts of the U.S. We'll continue to monitor that story, and as soon as we get more details, we will bring them to you right here on The Close. Now, we do want to get back to what's been going on in the markets here on this Wednesday afternoon. Kathy Entwistle is joining us. She's managing director over at Morgan Stanley. And Kathy, a hard transition to make here, but it is sort of a reminder, I think, of the fact that people always can't get too comfortable, that there are a lot of things outside the realm of economic data and the Fed and corporate earnings that can have a major material impact on our psyche, and that, of course, could feed into economic conditions and, of course, into the market itself.
Absolutely. And as we were just saying earlier, every day there's something new. And a lot of times what's new is also very big, and that's a perfect example. And so what I've been telling clients all year long, and I think it's very important, especially under situations like this where there's disruptions in the world and events that we have no control over, what we can control is what we do with our money and our investing in our portfolio. And I say don't panic and just stay the course, stay disciplined. And that to me is extremely important in times like this.
And this is also a reminder, particularly given your background and dealing with high net worth clients, that, you know, we always kind of joke with a lot of wealth managers that, you know, this is less about managing money and more about managing personalities and managing risk appetite. And I do kind of wonder how you deal with the psychology of investors right now when there still is a great deal of uncertainty, not just geopolitics and the wars and all that, but even in the realm of economics, in the realm of finance. I don't think anyone really knows what's around the corner, and anyone who tells you they know probably is, let's just say, full of it.
Absolutely. So I like to say that we are therapists too at times, right? And I've been doing this for over 25 years. So I've been through a lot of different market cycles as well as a lot of different events. And basically, at the end of the day, what we want to do is keep calm, pay attention to where we are, and look at the, you know, for example, your portfolio. If there are things in your portfolio that maybe it's time you don't want to have it there anymore and the markets are going up, the volatility is bringing the markets higher, it's time to peel off some of that. When the markets are getting hit, it's a good opportunity to step in and start investing in the areas that you've been waiting to become a little bit cheaper. So there are different techniques and different philosophies that we can use, and also having a long-term view always makes a difference. We know that it can get bumpy, but long-term we always tend to do well.
Well, you bring up therapy, and I think about the bond market because it has just been all over the place the last 6 months. And I'm curious what your conversations with clients sound like right now, because you do have very high yields, but you have a lot of volatility to accompany that.
Absolutely. And I do think sometimes we have to look at volatility as our friend when it comes to investing, and we just have to read it. So for bonds, I've been telling clients to take their short-term money, the cash that's been sitting in the 5%, you know, money markets and preferred savings or whatever the rate may be, and start thinking about longer duration and locking some of those rates in for the longer time period. Because this too will change and this too will pass, and those interest rates will come down. And if you wait with your money in cash until the interest rates come down and then decide to go ahead and invest longer term, you're going to miss out on today's rates. So that's where we're going right now.
And it does seem like conviction is really building that maybe we did finally see the ceiling in rates. And with that in mind, how are you thinking about fixed income relative to equities when you're putting together a portfolio?
Absolutely. So, you know, it used to be there was like the 60-40, 60 equities, 40 bonds. The last you know, few years, we haven't really been investing a lot of new money into fixed income because the rates were so low. But 18 months ago, when we had that correction, they became much more attractive. So we've been investing, and slowly but surely, not all at once, but also almost like dollar cost averaging into the bond market too.
Well, this gets to the bigger question, too, because everyone talks about that maybe we're at that point where you do extend duration, at least in some sort of responsible way. I don't necessarily see the same talk about pushing deeper into cyclicals and longer duration equities. Why?
I think because a lot of people are looking at valuations, and you have to think about the fundamentals. And there's probably still a little bit more headwind coming with corporate earnings, and we have to get into next year. It's been, more of a surprise than not for most that we have had some runs in different parts of the market and with the Magnificent Seven. But overall, we want people to think methodically about it and have an allocation where we're adding to the allocation. Often small caps and mid caps do well after a difficult time in the economy. So we want to make sure clients are there and also touching a little bit into international as well.
All right, Kathy, it's always great to talk to you. I have a wonderful and safe Thanksgiving. Kathy Entwistle there, Managing Director over at Morgan Stanley. We are continuing to monitor that situation at the U.S.-Canadian border around the Niagara Falls region, where an explosion and a fire was reported of a vehicle that was trying to make the crossing into the U.S. Not a lot of details, but we have heard from authorities on both sides of the border, including Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, as well as the governor of the state of New York, that have said that their respective agencies now are on high alert, keeping an eye on the border crossings in the Niagara region that for right now are closed. We'll be back in a moment. This is Bloomberg. All right, let's turn now to the state of the U.S. economy. Following a slew of data that we got this morning, as well as the release yesterday of the Fed's minutes from the last policy meeting. Joining us now to talk about this is Yelena Shulyatyeva, senior U.S. economist over at BNP Paribas. And Yelena, I want to start off actually with inflation and inflation expectations, because I was taking a look at that University of Michigan survey. And again, it's a survey. I know that, and I'm sure you'll give me the asterisk on it. But it still seems to suggest that most folks out there, Elena, think that inflation is going to remain high.
Look, consumers see that prices are still high, and it doesn't matter that they're going slightly down in terms of growth rates. So I think people just see that, things are still expensive going into this major time for the U.S. consumer, the holiday season, and people are not happy about it. If you look at other questions in the University of Michigan survey, you'll see that buying conditions for durable goods, for homes, for other things, they have deteriorated quite significantly. A part of it is obviously higher interest rates, but prices too are very, very high, and consumers don't like it.
And it's interesting, too. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about what some people see as a disconnect between what the Fed has been saying and what people on the ground appear to be seeing. But when I was looking at those Fed minutes and I was looking at some of the Fed speak that we got prior to that, the Fed kind of seems to be in the same boat, at least on the idea that they need to still be on guard for a potential resurgence.
Totally. It was very interesting that there were a lot of alls in that set of FOMC minutes. There seems to be a lot of agreement about the fact that the Fed needs to proceed more cautiously at this point, even if they have this tightening bias in place. So obviously they are monitoring inflation and inflation expectations very closely, but our view has been that they have reached the terminal rate, and the next move will be a cut. On that front, I think it's also very important to note that there's a lot of agreement on the committee that policy needs to remain restrictive for some time, and there is no hint about when that will end.
Well, can we talk about and try to define what for some time actually means? Because higher for longer, a lot of people have heard that, and still you take a look at what's priced into the market and you see almost 2 full cuts priced in by June or July, depending on when you actually check. What's your thinking on how long they actually stay at terminal now that, in your view, they're there?
So our projection is for the Fed not to cut rates until June. And then we'll see a few more cuts going into the second half of the year. The reasoning behind that is inflation is still high. Prices are still sticky, and there is no immediate downturn in the economy. There's been some slowing, and there's some slowing in the labor market is happening, but there is no collapse or more significant decline in economic data that would justify the Fed acting prematurely. They really don't want to be in a position, Arthur Burns was back in the day, and there is a lot of legacy from that Fed that they need to be remembered for. So I think they will be patient. They will wait if the data permits, and we don't see any action until June.
Elena, I'm going to have to leave it there. Always great to talk to you. Have a safe holiday, and we'll talk to you again.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Likewise. We do need to get back to our big breaking news here. The situation on one of those Niagara Falls border crossings between the U.S. and Canada. The Canadian Safety Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, speaking right now. Let's listen in.
Frontaliers ne sont pas fermés, mais c'est une situation qui évolue de minute en minute. Évidemment, on prendra les décisions qui s'imposent quand on aura des renseignements fiables. Merci beaucoup.
We were just listening there to Dominic LeBlanc speaking in French, as you can hear. He did speak a little bit earlier, and we did get a translation of some of those headlines, basically confirming that there was an explosion, in his words, along the Rainbow Bridge border crossing between Niagara Falls on the U.S. side and Niagara Falls on the Canadian side. He calls the situation, quote, very serious, and says that they are now monitoring it and trying to figure out what actually happened. He says that the situation is evolving, but did not provide any more details beyond that. So again, what we know right now, confirmation from the Canadian Safety Minister that there was an explosion of a vehicle along that Rainbow Bridge. As the cause of that, as to whether how many people or if anyone was actually injured in that, we have yet to get official confirmation, though other media sources, including Fox News, are reporting that there might have been at least 2 fatalities.
And like you said, it's important to keep in mind this is an evolving situation, waiting for official confirmation here. But what we do know, of course, is that New York Governor Kathy Hochul is traveling to the scene, been briefed on the incident, closely monitoring the situation. Of course, we heard from Canada's leader as well, Justin Trudeau. You can see him speaking there. So again, a quickly evolving situation on the heels of the Thanksgiving holiday when, Romaine, we know that there's a lot of travel. And this particular crossing, the Rainbow Bridge, of course, connecting the U.S. and Canada, is heavily frequented crossing, obviously in focus now, as are all the other crossings between the 2 countries.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to continue to monitor this situation, and we're still awaiting to hear, I guess, whether there are other border crossings affected by this, other than those that are in that Niagara region. Of course, the geography of this, Katie. I mean, folks in New York know this, but for those outside, this is basically the northeast portion of the United States, the southeastern portion of Canada here. I think they said this particular bridge has about 90,000 crossings over the course of a month. There are at least, as we heard from John Ehrlichman, about 4 other crossings in this immediate area that have also been shut down. In total, across the entire length of the U.S.-Canadian border, at least 21 bridges and tunnels that are used for commercial and passenger vehicles.
Yeah, we know that those bridges are the Rainbow Bridge, the Peace Bridge, the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge, and the Whirlpool Bridge, all closed at the moment, of course, amid this FBI investigation.
We'll be back in a moment. This is The Close on Bloomberg. Just a little more than an hour ago, we learned that one of the key border crossings in the Niagara Falls region that connects the U.S. and Canada had been shut down. We're now learning some more details as just to why. We just heard from the Canadian Safety Minister as well as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. They're confirming that there was an explosion of a vehicle along the Rainbow Bridge border crossing. John Ehrlichman, anchor for us at Bloomberg, BNN, up there in Canada, joining us right now. John, what have we learned in the past few minutes?
Well, it continues to be, Romaine, a fluid situation. But on top of that, acknowledgement from the Prime Minister here in Canada, we have seen an AP headline around the White House monitoring the situation as well. As you alluded to, just to recap, what we do know at this point, a vehicle exploded at a checkpoint on the American side of the U.S.-Canada bridge in Niagara Falls. And for anyone who's ever traveled to Niagara Falls, this is not too far from the falls themselves. And so for those who are familiar with that location, certainly a very popular tourist location. But that incident prompted the closure of multiple border crossings. We've already highlighted a number, including the Peace Bridge, which connects Buffalo to Fort Erie, the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge, and the Whirlpool Bridge. And we continue to hear, Romaine, headlines around surrounding areas and impacted roadways, closures, for example, for obviously security reasons right now. We've talked a little bit about the response so far from local authorities and Governor Kathy Hochul addressing the situation as well. On this side of the border, we know that the Premier of Ontario, like the Prime Minister, has been briefed on the situation. He was made aware, and he's been dealing with some of the local authorities, but also the RCMP in this country is also involved with the situation. We should mention that for those who are traveling at the airport as well, there is an awareness at various facilities for airport travelers in the Buffalo International Airport, the Buffalo Niagara International Airport. There has been some confirmation of additional screening that will now be taking place as a result. The Niagara Frontier Transport Authority, for example, saying that all cars that are arriving at the Buffalo airport would be undergoing security checks. As for what ultimately transpired, of course, we're continuing to go through some of the details on that. No further information immediately available, Romaine, on the cause of the explosion. We did get from the field office for the FBI in Buffalo that statement that it's investigating the blast. And then there were all of those photos and video that was taken by bystanders and provided on social media, which showed thick smoke, flames on the pavement, and a security booth that had been singed by the flames. There were videos that showed the fire was in a U.S. Customs and Border Protection area, which is just east of the main vehicle checkpoint. But of course, on that front, we continue to await more details.
And we are learning now that Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg has also been briefed on the Rainbow Bridge explosion. And talk to us a little bit more about the other bridges impacted here. Of course, this explosion took place near the Rainbow Bridge, that U.S.-Canada crossing. There's at least 3 other bridges that have been shut down. Where do they sit in relation to the Rainbow Bridge?
Well, just to recap what we did here, Katie, from the Niagara Falls Bridge Commission, all 4 of the crossings. As we mentioned, the others, Lewiston, Whirlpool, and the Peace Bridge, that they were closed. And for anyone who's familiar with that area, obviously there's a lot of local traffic, which includes local cross-border traffic, but this is obviously coming at a very busy travel time for many people. Now, with respect to the Rainbow Bridge itself, Bloomberg had been sharing some numbers earlier about upwards of 90,000 crossings into the U.S. Last month alone. So we're talking about a lot of activity, and certainly activity at a time of travel for a lot of people heading into the U.S. long weekend. Some of the eyewitness commentary that's been coming in, Romaine and Katie. One interesting comment coming from one of the local stations, WGRZ TV, which spoke with a gentleman who said he saw a vehicle speeding toward the crossing from the U.S. side of the border when it swerved to avoid another car and then crashed into a fence and exploded. And I'll just quote from that interview where they said all of a sudden he went up in the air and then it was a ball of fire like 30 or 40 feet high. I never saw anything like it. And so given the situation and the uncertainty, and as we mentioned with the FBI commentary on the fluidity of the situation, getting back to your question, Katie, I mean, you're talking about those key border crossings between our 2 nations, now we're starting to get at the federal level in both countries more awareness. We mentioned those comments coming from the Associated Press tied to the White House and recently the Prime Minister. My colleagues at CTV News are being told, by the way, this is just breaking now, their national security sources, that government officials are operating under the assumption this incident is terror related. Now, this is reporting that's just been done here at BNN Bloomberg by our sister network, CTV News, that their national security sources are saying that the government officials here are operating under the assumption the incident is terror-related. There's a meeting of all security-related organizations, departments that's happening as we speak.
Okay, and this gets to the broader question, John, and you may not be able to answer this, about cooperation amongst the authorities on both the U.S. side and the Canadian side.
Well, I think probably the first order of business on that, and we did hear those comments that you took live from the Public Safety Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, is to just get everybody on the same page. Even our CTV colleagues are reporting that officials are simply trying to determine if this is an isolated incident. And as we know from past periods of uncertainty, when you're trying to figure that out, it does speak to the fact of why you have seen this broader concern about other locations, other border crossings, other points of entry like the airports that we were talking about, and other modes of transportation or facilities. If officials are trying to determine if this is an isolated incident, one would expect that that has required that coordinated effort by authorities on both sides of the border just to contain the situation. And obviously, whether that's at the border crossings, the roadways, or any other location nearby, there has been this urging of caution.
All right, John, going to have to leave it there. Great reporting. John Ehrlichman, our man up there in Toronto at BNN. What we know right now is that federal authorities on both sides of the border, Canadian and in the U.S., are now investigating a vehicle explosion along the Rainbow Bridge that connects the Niagara Falls region. We're diving deeper into the details as soon as we get them, and as soon as we get them, we'll bring them to you. This is Bloomberg.
Explosion at the Rainbow Bridge crossing. I've been briefed by the NSIA and the Minister of Public Safety.
Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, speaking just moments ago, confirming that explosion along the Rainbow Bridge connecting the Niagara Falls on both the U.S. and the Canadian side of the border. A very fluid situation with details coming from a lot of different directions. But what we know now is federal authorities on both sides of the border now investigating what they say was an explosion along that bridge. Multiple reports, including from CNN and Fox, say that at least 2 people were killed in that explosion. And there is at least one report that says it is being investigated as an act of terrorism. We were just checking in with John Ehrlichman in Toronto. Let's go now to Ottawa, the capital of Canada, where our bureau chief in our Bloomberg offices in Ottawa, Laura Dillon-Kane, is joining us right now. And Laura, I bring up the terrorism angle of this with the understanding that we don't have official confirmation of that. But if this is the suspicion, should we expect additional border closings beyond what's happening right now in the immediate Niagara Falls region?
I think it's a very fluid situation, as you heard the Prime Minister say. I will say Canada's Public Safety Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, just described this as a violent incident. That does suggest, this was an intentional act that is a deep source of concern for Canadian and U.S. authorities. He said that any time a piece of infrastructure as essential as a border crossing is targeted, that is a huge source of concern for U.S. and Canadian governments. So they are talking, they're speaking very closely, the American side, with the Canadians. They're sharing intelligence, and they're trying to understand what happened. What will happen next at border crossings remains an open question, but it does seem that this is being taken extremely seriously, all the way to the top of the Canadian government, with the Prime Minister making a statement in our House of Commons today.
Well, Laura, tell us what we know right now when it comes to the border crossings and those closures. As we understand it, 4 bridges are closed, and as of right now, the airports are still open and operational.
That's right, yes. As far as we know, the airports are still operational, at least on the Canadian side. There are 4 border crossings that are closed, and it is a source of grave concern for Canadian officials. The Public Safety Minister also said he would be speaking with the U.S. Homeland Security Secretary soon, that he's speaking with the Canada Border Services Agency, that they're getting information and intelligence from all over to try and get to the bottom of what happened here. He was unwilling yet to confirm any casualties linked to the incident, but describing it as a violent act certainly it appears that we're getting close to that confirmation. And both he and the Prime Minister are describing it as an extremely serious incident. The Prime Minister is saying it's going to occupy him for the rest of the day. So they are now, the Prime Minister had to excuse himself from the House of Commons so that he could go and join more briefings on this. So they are absolutely seized with this issue. And I know that it is Thanksgiving tomorrow, so for Americans who are traveling, I would be very aware that there may be further measures at border crossings and airports.
Well, I think that's why a lot of folks are on edge, particularly if it does have any major disruptions to folks' travel plans. And it gets to a broader question here, Laura, and this is kind of more of a broader question about just the security of the Canadian and U.S. border. At least here in the U.S., as I'm sure you know, most of the political discourse is usually about our southern border. But there have been some questions, particularly when you go a little bit further west, as to how fluid some of those borders are and whether there should be more security measures in place to prevent whether it's terrorism, drug trafficking, or anything else.
Yes, that's right. We are already seeing that dialogue starting in Canada as the Prime Minister came out in the House of Commons to make his statement. Our leader of the opposition, the Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, immediately asked him what he is doing about security at the border. Is this something that needs to be looked at in the wake of this? If the reports are true about injuries and casualties, then clearly there were perhaps not enough measures taken to prevent something like this from occurring. So I think as the situation unfolds and we learn more, those questions will certainly continue to be asked, and they are already being asked at a political level here at this point. But I will say that, Canada and the U.S., we are known to have a very close relationship. I think we pride ourselves on the fact that we can move relatively freely across the border, at least at land border crossings, and it will be interesting to see if this results in a further tightening of that border.
All right, Laura Dillon-Kane, our bureau chief in our Ottawa offices here at Bloomberg. Again, just to reiterate what we know right now, an explosion that occurred in a vehicle that was crossing the Rainbow Bridge connecting the U.S. and Canada in the Niagara Falls region that has effectively shut down that bridge as well as nearby border crossings as well. The governor of the state of New York is on her way to Buffalo, which of course borders that area, and while Canadian authorities, including Justin Trudeau and as well as his deputy ministers, now meeting to figure out what happened and what the next response should be. We'll keep an eye on this situation and bring you any details as soon as we get them. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to The Close. It's time now for our Wall Street Week Daily segment. Pleased to say joining us right now is Marc Rosen. He's the CEO of JCPenney, joining us, of course, at a very apt time where the holiday shopping season is scheduled to kick off. And a lot of folks right now really focus in on consumer trends, what we're buying, and more importantly, how much we're going to buy. Marc, I do want to dive into what's going on specifically with JCPenney, but before we get there, I do want to just get your broader thoughts here about consumer spending and whether you think we are going to see a holiday shopping season that is at least kind of commensurate with what we've had in previous years.
Yeah, I think we absolutely will see a holiday that is commensurate with that. What we're seeing is half of consumers are actually saying they are going to spend more this year. I think what you are going to see is that consumers are much more focused on value than they've ever been before, and we're seeing that in shopping behavior this year.
We've had some earnings reports from folks like Burlington and TJX, which seem to show that trend certainly in place. A lot of folks trading down, and it's not just low-income consumers. You even have higher-income consumers also trading down as well. And I'm wondering whether you've actually seen that in your stores as well.
Yeah, so I think if we step back for a minute and just talk about our consumer. The consumer in our store is, we say our customers, America's diverse working families. It's a $75,000 median household income. So if you think of our customer, it's the teachers who are teaching our children. It's the medical workers who are taking care of us and our families. And for that consumer, inflation has definitely been a challenge. And so what we're seeing is the consumer is looking more for value. The consumer is more focused on price. We're seeing more responsiveness to when we're offering promotions and things like that. And, we've been really successful by doing what we're saying we're doing, which is taking inflation out of the holiday for our customers. We've gone back and taken hundreds of items that we had last year, and we're offering the same prices last year or lower. And we have thousands of gift items that are under $15 for our customer.
I'm curious as to how you're pricing this. When you say at those low prices, are those basically, I guess, the full retail price, if you will, meaning that low price, or is that the price you get to after taking into account a discount or coupon?
So I'm talking about the Black Friday price. Okay. And so our Black Friday prices are the lowest prices that we offer.
How are you going to get people, I guess, to buy? Is this about getting them physically into your store locations, or is this going to be much more of an online e-commerce strategy?
I think it's going to be a bit of both, and we've seen success across both online and in store. We launched our Black Friday early. We launched November 3rd through 5th, and we saw great success. We saw a big increase in our store traffic, and we also saw really strong buying online. If you think about the event that we're going into, tomorrow, Thanksgiving Day, will be an online day. And Friday, Black Friday morning, is going to be an in-store day. And to really encourage that in-store experience on Black Friday morning, we're going to have events going throughout the day. So we have events starting at 5 a.m., again at 9 a.m., 1 p.m., and 5 p.m. And just to give you a couple examples of what we're going to be doing, some customers will actually get $500 off a $500 purchase. In other words, we'll pay for their entire purchase. And that will be by a snap pack that they receive when they come into our store that will have coupons in it. And at 1 o'clock, we're going to be giving away diamonds. There's a diamond pendant necklace in each one of our stores, and 30,000 diamonds spread across our stores. So that's going to keep the excitement going in store throughout the day.
We have to talk a little bit about the turnaround going on. Of course, JCPenney went into bankruptcy protection a few years ago. You were brought in shortly after that, once Simon Property and Brookfield took it over. I am curious as to how things have gone since. I know you're not required to disclose your numbers publicly, but David Simon has been on the record saying, I think his exact words was something like unbelievably profitable is how things are going here. Can you quantify that for us at all?
Yeah, well, like you said, right, we are private, and so we don't release our earnings quarterly, and we don't share that information. But what I can tell you is this: what we're really focused on is the customer and bringing the customer back to shop at JCPenney and letting them really understand all the things that they can get. And so we launched in September. We launched $1 billion reinvestment in the brand, really remodeling our stores. We relaunched our website. We're improving our supply chain. And we launched a new advertising campaign called Make It Count that's really letting our customers understand how JCPenney can bring them that great value and give them a shopping experience where they don't have to make the trade-offs they have to make in their everyday life.
Well, I am curious. I mean, I've seen that ad, and I've seen some of the collaborations that you have, including the line of clothes kind of based off Abbott Elementary, the fictional television show. And I mean, just given your background at other retailers prior you got there, I mean, I'm sure you have to know that getting folks back to a brand, to a store brand, isn't always just about value. It's also about the cachet, and it's about the ethos, and it's about just kind of people feeling a connection here. JCPenney lost that. I mean, I think we can just say that flat out here. How is it getting it back?
I agree with you. It's all about bringing back relevance to the consumer. And you mentioned some of the collaborations that we're doing, and I talked about our customer, and I said our customer was the teacher who's teaching our kids. Abbott Elementary is spot on for that. We just launched a new line of cookware called Mesa Mia with Jenny Martinez. We've had huge success. It's now one of our biggest cookware brands. So it is about having the brands and the products and the things that are relevant to our consumer to bring them back into the store. And you asked about the transformation and how it's going and some proof points. And what we've seen is, whereas there was a decline in frequency of our customers visiting us for many years, we've now seen that turn over the last year. And we're now seeing an increase in customer frequency. We're seeing an increase in organic search for our brand. We're seeing an increase in Google search, and people are realizing that JCPenney is a brand that can bring them, the amazing products like St. John's flannel shirts that we have for $11.99 for holiday, like our Liz Claiborne brand, like Cooks in Home, that has an incredible value for customers. We're offering $14.99 blenders and a lot of small appliances for Black Friday. And when they see that and put that together, they realize that it is a place for them.
All right, Marc, great to talk to you. Marc Rosen, he's the CEO over there at JCPenney, heading into a very pivotal holiday shopping season. And Wall Street Week will have some of the best interviews of the year. That airs on Friday at 6 p.m. New York time, of course, hosted by David Weston. And David joins us normally every day around this time for our Wall Street Week daily segment right here on The Close. We continue to count you down to the closing bells and continue to monitor a developing situation at the U.S.-Canadian border. The explosion of a vehicle that was crossing the Rainbow Bridge connecting Niagara Falls on both sides of those borders. Multiple reports now saying that this is being investigated as a terrorist incident. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, calling the situation very serious. And authorities here in the United States, including President Joe Biden, saying they're also monitoring the situation and sending authorities to the border to aid in that investigation. We'll bring you more details as soon as we get them. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. Just about 3 p.m. here in New York. This is the countdown to the close. Let's get a view from the top. I'm Romaine Bostick.
And I'm Katie Greifeld.
The holiday shortened week is upon us, Katie Greifeld, with the Thanksgiving holiday tomorrow. Of course, markets closed here in the U.S. and a shortened trading day on Friday, which means a lot of the price action you're seeing today is going to need to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. But you are seeing gains pretty much across the board, modest gains to be sure, fractional on the S&P by about 0.4%.
Modest gains, and you weigh that against what we saw in terms of economic data this morning. You had initial jobless claims coming in lower than expected. At the same time, you take a look at some of those inflation expectations that came out of the University of Michigan survey, a little bit higher than expected. Still, the S&P 500 hanging on to gains, even as you start to see yields rise a bit in reaction.
We were joking yesterday about how low the VIX can go. At one point on the day, it did drop below 13 at 1282. Now back around that 13 level here, but still holding well below some of those longer term averages. Flip up the board here because I do want to talk about one particular stock, and that is Microsoft. Of course, that's been in the spotlight because of all of the nonsense surrounding Sam Altman and OpenAI. Microsoft now back on the front foot, up about 1% or so here on the day, erasing all of the losses from yesterday, and now on pace, Katie Greifeld, if you can believe it, for its best annual gain since at least 1999.
It's pretty surprising, too, and you think about the year that the NASDAQ 100 is having overall, and even with all the volatility this year, some really huge gains that we're looking at. Let's talk a little bit more about some of those individual movers. I think I have a sea of red to show you, and we're talking about the retailers here because we are at the tail end of retail reporting season. I want to start with Nordstrom. This was an interesting one. You actually had profit beat expectations. There were lower markdowns. There was better inventory management, but it was revenue at why the stock is down today. It fell short. You had a bigger than expected drop in sales. Nordstrom currently off by more than 5%. And
what else you got? I see you got Urban Outfitters up there. That's like the complete opposite of it. Do people still go there?
Apparently, I mean, maybe not as much as they would like to. Urban Outfitters down. This was not surprising. They had a comp sales miss that has been sort of the theme of this retail season. That was specifically at their namesake brand, and that was enough to overshadow some good news that you saw when it came to Anthropologie, when it came to Free People, some of the other brands under the Urban Outfitters umbrella.
There was one name on that screen that really surprised me. You had GES, the ticker for Guess, which I'm always, every earnings season, I'm always reminded they still exist, and they're still a publicly traded company.
I think I bought jeans there once, and I've never been back. Down 10% today.
That was all the rage when I was a kid.
Well, it missed on revenue. It cut its full year EPS guy.
You don't know what Gerbeau? If I say Gerbeau, does that mean anything to you?
I got nothing.
Oh, okay.
I got nothing. Guess at least, I bought those jeans once. Basically, there was softness in the Americas that offset the strength that you saw in Europe. You added together, and shares are off by about 10%.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I think this is going to be a tale of two cities for retailers this holiday season, which officially kicks off here on this Friday. Stick with us on this Wednesday. Our cross-platform coverage of today's top stories starts right now.
Countdown to the close. Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is the countdown to the close. Romaine Bostick here alongside Katie Greifeld. We're joined now by our colleagues Carol Massar and Tim Senovic. Welcome to our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms. As a lot of folks set out here for travel for the Thanksgiving Day holiday here in the U.S., and a very somber reminder here of just how perilous sometimes things can be. We continue to monitor the situation going on right now at the U.S.-Canadian border in Niagara Falls, where a car that was crossing that bridge into the United States exploded. Multiple reports are now saying that this was intentional. We did get confirmation from the Canadian Safety Minister who called this, quote, a violent act. There are still a lot of details, Carol, that we do not know. What we do know right now is that border crossing is shut, as long as several other border crossings in the Niagara Falls region.
Right. The Peace Bridge, the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge, the Whirlpool Bridge, along with the Rainbow Bridge, have been shut down. And, you know, Romaine, you're right. There's some details that we feel like we have gotten confirmation on, but there's a lot that we don't know. We know the FBI is leading this investigation, obviously working with U.S. and Canadian officials on this, trying to gather more information. Different sources reporting different things about possible fatalities, but again, we're looking for some more confirmation. ABC News talking about finding a briefcase, but again, these details, we're waiting for full confirmation really from the officials who are on the scene.
This is coming at a time which is set to be among the busiest travel periods of the year, not just on roadways, but also at airports and at border crossings, Katie. So it is important to keep in mind that, you know, there are many people who will be traveling for Thanksgiving in and throughout the United States, and this only comes at a time when you can certainly expect heightened security around this.
Absolutely, and of course, not just by road, by these bridges, but by air as well. And what we know so far is that Buffalo and Niagara Falls, the airports in those regions, they still remain fully operational at this point. That's according to the Niagara Frontier Transportation Authority, but they have stepped up security there when it comes to security checks. So we'll see how that transpires.
Yeah, and I just want to put this in context, too, just in terms of the number of folks, at least the folks in the U.S. traveling. Something like 30 million people, this is according to the FAA, typically fly in this 11-day stretch surrounding the Thanksgiving holiday. AAA, which is the Automobile Association here, says about 49 million other people will actually use their cars for long-distance travel over the 5-day stretch from Wednesday to Sunday. And then you have another 1.5 million travelers that are going on buses, trains, and cruise ships to get to where they go. So this is a big travel weekend. And even though what happened in Canada may not affect a lot of those folks, it's certainly got to be top of mind as everyone sets out.
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head. And
I should just, sorry, just to interrupt you, Tim. And we are getting additional details from some of the local authorities here in New York, including from Mayor Eric Adams of New York City, saying that he has sent NYPD officers to offer support upstate, but he did say that the city here in New York City is now on heightened alert due to the situation up there in Canada.
Right, so enhanced security in a city that knows, certainly if this is ultimately terrorism, that knows terrorism all too well. And what's interesting, Katie, is I think about, you know, the market's very subdued reaction, but this is one of these reminders where we all thought this was going to be a quiet week. We had a lot of corporate news, no doubt about that, but it's also a reminder that things can kind of come at us. And when it comes to relating it back to what is our audience in a big way, is certainly the investing audience, these are things that can certainly attack sentiment, consumer sentiment, market sentiment, and that can certainly just provide a very significant factor going above and beyond any fatalities or any people who are impacted. But it's one of those things that can play into sentiment big time.
Absolutely, and it's a good reminder, too, that we are at a very tense crossroads when it comes to the geopolitical landscape right now. You think about what's going on in Ukraine, you think about what's going on in Israel and Palestine right now. Of course, that hit to sentiment is real.
All right, folks, we're going to watch the headlines. I know you guys are on your side. We are as well, and we'll keep everybody up to date and bring any new developments to our Bloomberg audience on many platforms, on radio, on TV, on YouTube, and, of course, on Bloomberg Originals. We will, though, wrap up the trading day at 4 p.m. Wall Street time. We'll see you then.
And we continue our coverage right here on The Close, counting you down to the closing bell here on this Wednesday afternoon. We're just about 50 minutes away from those bells as we head into a holiday here in the U.S. where markets tomorrow will be closed. But there's a lot of debate right now about the long-term direction of this market once we get past that. Jay Berry joining us right now. He's co-head of U.S. rate strategy over at JPMorgan. And Jay, let's get right to it. I know the price action this week, probably not much to read into, but I think we've gotten a little bit of a flavor of where folks' heads are at. And there are a lot of people that seem to think that rates are going to start to go down.
Hi, Romaine, and thanks for having me today. Yeah, I think that's our view as we look forward to 2024, that We think what we've learned over the last few weeks from the Fed, as well as from the data flow, that there's an increasing likelihood that the Fed is done tightening, and we feel comfortable with that view. We also do think that it's going to be some time until the Fed begins lowering rates. But if that's the case, as we look ahead to next year, it presents a more positive return outlook for bonds for the first time in the last 3 years. Thinking about a Fed that's done and likely pivoting to easing, we think at some point in the second half of next year. But I think there's some likelihood that we need to consider that those returns may be more muted than they've been in similar periods around Fed easing in the past, because tightening is done, but we see the QT process still running in the background for most of next year.
It's interesting, though, when you look at some of the price action, Jay, and particularly when you look at the longer end of the curve and the term premium that's being priced in, there still seems to be a lot of folks out there that are betting on this idea that we are indeed heading for softer economic times, if not an all-out recession.
Yeah, I think we are not forecasting a recession for next year. We see growth troughing at 0.5% in the middle of the year. But that should be materially weaker than this year, which was significantly above trend. And I think the issue that we have is it's a hard time identifying what the nonlinearity is that drives us into a recession, because consumer balance sheets are still strong. There's strength at the state and local government level as well. But nonetheless, we see it hard to repeat the growth that we've had this year. And if that's the case, you can debate about the timing around the Fed easing, but there is probably scope for long end yields to fall. But your question and your discussion about term premium, Romaine, is an important one. We've gone 50 basis points lower from where we were just a month ago because of the combination of the Fed, the data, and even the Treasury Department recognizing that perhaps the issuance schedule that it had put itself on could all be contributing to higher rates. And each of those pressures are a bit lower than they were this time a month ago.
Well, there's a lot we could say about term premium, but I actually want to go back to what you said about QT continuing to run in the background, because I take a look at your forecast. I see 100 basis points of cuts priced in next year. Is that to say that the Fed will continue to run off the balance sheet while at the same time lowering rates?
Yeah, that's exactly what we see, Katie. And I think, there's a couple of reasons to consider this. First and foremost, it seems like you might have the Fed in opposition by running both of its main policy levers in opposite directions. But something that Chair Powell told us back in July, and we've seen in the minutes of the most recent November FOMC meeting, is that FOMC participants can envision the Fed continuing to run down its balance sheet even as it cuts rates, because the balance sheet is still too large. And I think it really depends on what type of easing cycle it is. If it's a normalization and the Fed's lowering rates as we think because inflation is moderating, then there's reasons to think that QT can run on even as the Fed cuts. But if it's a full-blown recession and the Fed needs to move accommodative, then I think it's very likely that its balance sheet normalization will draw to an end there. So, that's why we lean towards QT running throughout the year, but we can understand that if it's a worse growth outcome than we have penciled in, that it may actually stop.
Well, that'll be definitely an interesting communication challenge to see the Fed try to navigate there. But I also want to go to the point you made about where demand is going to be. You write in your notes that demand is shifting away from price-insensitive hands towards more price-sensitive investors. And with that being the case, what does that mean for where fair value, where rates should be, especially at the long end?
Yeah, this has been a topic that we've been very intensely focused on for the last 9 to 12 months. And you talk about that price-insensitive demand. The Fed, U.S. banks, and foreign investors at their peak represented a 75% share of Treasury market ownership a few years ago. Now it's closer to 55%, and we think it's headed lower. And this is against the backdrop of a Treasury market in which we're expecting to see duration supply, that is net interest rate risk, rising by about 20% next year. So the combination of those factors to us makes us think that yield curves will just be steeper over time. And it's going to mean that those price-sensitive buyers, mutual funds and asset managers, pension funds, hedge funds, are probably going to demand steeper curves, slightly higher yield levels in order to entice demand. And we do think it's going to take time to bring that price-sensitive demand back, again, because we've had what will be, in all likelihood, 3 consecutive years of negative total returns to risk-free assets, that it's going to take returns moving back into more positive territory to engender that demand, even though yields remain at their highest levels or close to their highest levels in 15 years.
All right, Jay, great to talk to you as always. Jay Barry, have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Jay Barry, co-head. Absolutely. Jay Barry, co-head of U.S. rate strategy over at JPMorgan. And we will continue our coverage here of what's what's going on in financial markets, but we do have to go back to what is now the top story of the day, and that is the explosion of a vehicle on the Rainbow Bridge connecting the U.S. and Canada in the Niagara Falls region. Bloomberg BNN's John Ehrlichman joining us now from Toronto with some more details as to what we know. Last time we spoke, John, I know we had just heard some comments from the Canadian Prime Minister as well as from one of his safety ministers. Here on the U.S. side, we have heard from an aide to President Joe Biden that he has been briefed on the situation, and they continue, of course, to closely follow the developments.
Well, certainly the fact that we have seen such quick coordination speaks to the strong relationship between our two nations. In this particular situation, though, the fact that this is quite literally happening at the border has required coordination at all levels of both law enforcement and, as you mentioned, now the president being briefed on the situation. And we had on Bloomberg shown some of that commentary from Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, in the House of Commons today. And our colleagues at CTV News have been talking about some of the response from government officials and treating the situation that is a very active one. In terms of the activity, Romaine, on the ground, just some context now that we are coming close to about 2 hours since we first started to see some headlines on what happened.
Yeah.
You know, it's very unusual to see this area, this footage from moments ago, right around a very popular tourist location such as Niagara Falls, to be so quiet.
I do have a question, John, though. I do have a question, and yeah, we should point out it was just about 1:20 New York time when we started to get headlines here in the U.S. about the incident. I am curious. We keep talking about how the border itself, that bridge crossing, is closed, but what about some of those tourist attractions surrounding that area? Have they also been shut down effectively?
Well, it's been hard to see specific locations on the attractions themselves, but we do know that many of the roadways in and around this area have been affected by this. Because there's high security precautions. I mean, a great example is at the local airports in Buffalo, for example, where there is still travel activity, but there is heightened security. And ultimately, having that kind of precautionary action does limit the flow and ultimately impacts perhaps some of those local businesses. I was going to mention, just with the Rainbow Bridge, approximately 1.5 million passenger vehicles that crossed the bridge in the first 10 months of the year. So when we talk about all of the border crossings being shut down, the Peace Bridge, if you look at the actual vehicle traffic over the course of a year, tends to be higher. But certainly this speaks to the broader reality that, at least with a border crossing, which in some of what Bloomberg had been headlining earlier, spoke to, I believe, around 90,000 crossings last month. Certainly, this is a very active area. It's an active area, especially so at a time of travel between two countries, the holiday Thanksgiving. And, you know, I think the commentary that we've seen on both sides of the border is, let's get briefed, let's figure out what's happening. As the Prime Minister here in Canada mentioned, it is a very serious situation that they are going to try to get more answers to. Yeah. And that is the part we're still trying to get more answers to on this.
All right, John, well, we appreciate you staying on top of this story for us. Our thanks to Bloomberg BNN's John Ehrlichman in Toronto. From New York, this is Bloomberg. All right, it's time now for our Muni Moment, and our next guest says that even if we enter a recession in 2024, U.S. municipalities are sitting on record levels of reserves and are well positioned to face those headwinds. Joining us now, I'm pleased to say we have Arlen Bohner. She is head of U.S. Public Finance over at Fitch Ratings. And Arlen, talk us through that a little bit. When you think about the levels of reserves that we have right now, how does that compare to other recessionary periods or potential recessionary periods?
Right. Thanks for having me, Katie. Whether we hit a recession or if we just hit some slower growth in 2024, that really remains to be seen. But as you mentioned, most of our public finance entities are in pretty good shape and well positioned to face those headwinds. We know that the slowing economic activity will result in slowing revenues for U.S. states and local governments. But most of them have spent this period of time post-pandemic paying down debt, and they're sitting on those really high levels of reserves that you referenced and rainy day funds that should help them weather the storm. And, you know, to your point, to a much higher level than pre-pandemic. For utilities like water and sewer and public power utilities, those headwinds that they were facing relating to inflation and rising rates have eased a bit, but they've really just led to a new normal where utilities now have to account for higher costs across the board, and that may translate into rate increases in many cases.
And let's talk a little bit about the upgrade and the downgrade picture, because you point out in your notes that if you take a look over the third quarter, you actually had downgrades outpace upgrades. And this in particular caught my eye, that 6 of 8 sector outlooks are deteriorating right now. Sort of marry that together with the fact that you do have those record reserve levels, because those two sort of disparate facts seem to be at odds with each other.
So the 6 of 8, so the local governments are the ones that I was talking about that have the higher levels of reserves. So local governments and states have a lot of reserves. We are still thinking that we are going to have neutral credit conditions for them going into 2024. In 2023, we were anticipating that we would be hitting recession in 2023. So when we had those 2023 outlooks set, we were anticipating a different macroeconomic condition than what we actually hit. We have had an uptick in downgrades, but still relatively balanced. Downgrades were slightly outpacing upgrades in the third quarter, and many of those were related to the U.S. sovereign downgrade. There were a couple of linked ratings that needed to be lowered when we lowered that rating as well.
All right, Arlene, it's really great to check in with you. Our thanks to Arlene Bohner. She is head of U.S. Public Finance at Fitch Ratings. Much more ahead. This is The Close on Bloomberg.
All right, stocks are higher on the day on this Wednesday afternoon, but volume is incredibly light ahead of the Thursday holiday here in the U.S. That would be Thanksgiving, and of course a truncated trading session on Friday. So today, Katie Greifeld, might be as good as it gets.
Yeah, you take a look at volume, just to put some numbers to that. Volume on the S&P 500 currently 20% lower versus the 20-day average. I think that tells you everything you need to know. But still, you do see stocks a little bit higher, even though we got some data this morning that would suggest that the labor market is still doing well, and consumers still see pretty hefty inflation ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's kind of that yin and yang that I think really has people kind of confused as to whether you're starting to price in an economic upswing or you're still waiting on that economic downturn. At least for today, I guess people don't mind. 10 of the 11 sectors higher on the day, and most of the Magnificent Seven doing exactly what they were designed to do, which is be magnificent.
At the same time, you are seeing people sell bonds across the curve, yields higher.
Bonds?
Yeah, indeed. People not necessarily looking for safety when it comes to bonds. That VIX, we're just going to keep an eye on it. As you said earlier, it did dip below 13. We're trading right above it right now. Volatility draining from this market.
We should point out there are a lot of interesting individual stories out there beyond the broader markets. Travel stocks are getting a bid on the day based on some data that came out that seemed to suggest here that this is going to be relatively busy holiday season for travel, not just around Thanksgiving, but all the way through the end of the year. And then, of course, you had those earnings that we got out of Deere this morning, which were like, yikes.
Yeah, not a great quarter for Deere or the retailers.
All right, stick with us. We're counting you down to the close. This is Bloomberg. This is the countdown to the close. Just about 30 minutes left here with stock prices up, a volume lower, and what is the last full trading day of this holiday shortened week.
Yeah, not many people around trading right now, but you are looking at a rally if you take a look at the S&P 500, and it's pretty broad too. If you take a look at the sector level, most of the sectors in the green right now. Up at the top, you have communication services. A lot of that coming from News Corp and from Meta. That sector up about 0.9%. Consumer staples also doing well. So too is healthcare. Those are your leaders. You go down the list. Again, not too many losers today. Your relative outperformer is energy, Romaine, but that's just barely off, currently lower by about 0.1%.
Well, let's talk about one of the more notable losers. This really caught my eye earlier today, and that was the earnings that we got out of Deere. Shares down 3% here, one of the bigger decliners that we're seeing in the S&P 500. That's largely because of the profit forecast they gave, which was well below what the street was looking for. And this is really just all about crop prices. As those crop prices dropped over the course of the last few months, that meant farmers had a lot less confidence in buying new equipment, and that's really playing out right now in Deere's last quarter as well as the current quarter. Whether it goes beyond that remains to be seen. Tesla also down here on the day, giving back all of the gains that it had over the previous 3 days here. No real news, but keep an eye on this stock heading into next week, because of all the sort of focus on Elon Musk and all the nonsense he's doing on social media. They are, if you believe what Elon Musk says, supposed to start deliveries of those Cybertrucks next week here. Be interesting to see whether there's any material impact on the stock. And then two interesting stories here. First of all, Ingersoll Rand only up 0.3%, but I was taking a look at this stock earlier. If you go through the Russell 1000, it's the only stock, it's the longest win streak among all of the Russell 1000 stocks on a 12-day run right now and at a record high. And then Beachbody. This was an incredibly intriguing story. The shares opened lower by about 15%. And then in the span of about 45 minutes, basically surged about 60 percentage points off the lows of the day before being halted. Now, this company last night had a 1-for-50 reverse stock split, and apparently there were some erroneous trades in the pre-market session that the NYSE said need to be sorted out. The shares have now resumed trading and are up 13% on the day, but quite a wild ride today for Beachbody, Katie.
Well, we want to turn back now to the developing story at the U.S.-Canada border after that vehicle explosion. The FAA now saying that the Buffalo airport is closed to both departing and arriving flights. Let's bring in Bloomberg's White House editor, Kate Hunter, for the latest from D.C. And Kate, what so far has the response from the Biden administration been?
Well, President Biden, as you probably know, flew up to Nantucket last night to begin his Thanksgiving holiday. We did hear from the White House a short while ago that the president has been briefed and is meeting with members of his team up there in Nantucket about the incident that occurred at Niagara Falls or near Niagara Falls. And so it sounds like we may hear more from the White House as we learn more from law enforcement agencies. But President Biden has been read in and is, responding to the situation.
There's just a question right now, I guess, about how safe some of the other points of entry into the United States, as well as our airports and train stations within the United States, and what, as you know, Kate, is one of the busiest travel times. Have we heard anything official out of the U.S. government as to any additional measures that have been taken to make sure those places are safe?
Well, we know that the borders around the Niagara area have been closed, the U.S.-Canada borders there. And we know that there have been some efforts in New York State to step up security measures. In fact, New York's Governor Kathy Hochul is heading to the Buffalo area or heading to the area in order to, meet with officials on the ground and assess the situation. I think it is worth noting that this did come up at the briefing, and I should say at the outset, these are early hours. We don't yet know exactly what the cause of this was. There have been some reports that it's terrorism related, but, that has not been confirmed. But there were questions at the briefing, the White House briefing this week, about whether there would be increased concern and increased monitoring around the Thanksgiving holiday, given the concern about the risk of terrorism around the Thanksgiving holiday. And we were told at the time, the reporters in the room were told that they weren't monitoring really anything specific, but that, of course, they would be vigilant. And of course, an event like Thanksgiving, when a lot of people are on the road and traveling, would be a natural time to be even more vigilant than normal. So, that is something that has been on people's mind this week, and something that I would imagine has kind of already been in the works even prior to this latest development.
And from New York City, we did hear from New York City Mayor Eric Adams earlier saying that he sent NYPD officers to offer support upstate and that New York City is on heightened alert due to this upcoming holiday. And Kate, when you think about the border crossing between Canada, at least traveling by car, I mean, this is a pretty friendly neighbor of ours. What could this potentially mean for the security of that border, at least by car, going forward?
Well, it's interesting because there's been so much effort and so much scrutiny of, permeability and risk at the southern border, the U.S. border with Mexico, and really not a lot of attention, as you pointed out, to the border to the north with Canada. That's always kind of been viewed as, a little bit less risky and hasn't had as much focus on trying to secure that. Now, we know that Congress is on break right now for the Thanksgiving holiday. They're going to come back next week, and they're already going to be looking at a funding package that includes money to increase border security, primarily at the southern border. And so I think that'll be something to watch, is whether there's some movement towards redirecting some resources or directing additional resources towards the border with Canada, given this development.
I'm curious I'm glad you pointed that out, because this has been a debate, and even before all the nonsense with McCarthy and all that, that they had been had there, and obviously their inability to pass a budget certainly complicates that. But do you think there would be enough bipartisan will to move something forward, like what you just said?
Well, it's gotten very complicated because, this emergency spending request has gotten tied up with the request for aid for Israel and as well as the request for aid for Ukraine. And so obviously there's a fair amount of Republican support for doing additional border control measures. But a lot of the context in which Republicans have approached that has been to be critical of the Biden administration. And so while the Biden administration has actually proposed more money for securing the border, it's been hard to kind of get the two sides together on that. And then you add the Israel aid and the Ukraine aid into the mix, and it just gets even more complicated. So I think trying to thread that needle for newly minted Speaker Johnson is going to be a big task when Congress gets back to town next week.
All right, Kate Hunter down in Washington helping us cover the White House. Again, we've already heard from the President of the United States. He has been briefed on the matter as he is on his holiday vacation. Other members of the administration also saying that they are monitoring the situation, as well as Canadian officials, too. We'll be back in a moment. This is The Close on Bloomberg.
All right, it's time now for the top three. Every day at this time, we do a deep dive into the people at the center of today's top stories. Romaine, who do you have your eye on?
Who do I have my eye on? Was Jack Ma. Did you look at the big downdraft that we had in Alibaba shares? I think it was about a week ago, last Thursday. It dropped like 10%, at least the ADRs here in the U.S. And that was because of a disclosure that Jack Ma was going to sell something like $900 million worth of Alibaba shares. And, well, I don't know what happened between then and now, but that share sale was supposed to take place yesterday, and it hasn't taken place. And we're now learning that apparently Jack Ma has decided not to sell those shares. Now, it's hard to actually know exactly what's going on here because, of course, none of this is actually coming from Jack Ma himself. Rather, it's coming from other folks. And there was a memo that was put out here by the chief people officer over at Alibaba saying that that share sale is now not taking place. Now, I don't know if that means ever or just for now.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, looking at that internal memo, apparently the stock price has not reached the level that the billionaire was seeking when he actually went through with that share sale. It's an interesting time for Alibaba, of course. You think about some of Jack Ma's plans for the company, maybe put on hold. And of course, it's an interesting time in U.S.-China relations as well.
Yeah, and we should point out that when they made that announcement, or when that filing was disclosed about the sale of the shares, I think that was also on the same day where they announced they were scuttling that plan to spin off the cloud business. So you wonder if all that's intertwined.
So that's person number one. Person number two.
There's two. How many are we doing?
We're doing
5?
three. We're doing 3. So I'll go and then you'll go. But let's talk about number 2 right now. We have Antoine Arnault. He is stepping down as Chief Executive Officer of Berluti. I hope I'm saying that right. The shoemaker that's part of LVMH. Now, this move comes amid an executive reshuffle that's really set to trigger questions over succession at the world's biggest luxury group. Of course, that succession story has been percolating in the background. Of course, this week, we've been obsessed with what's going on at OpenAI, but when it comes to this huge luxury company, something to think about as well.
I'm sure the backstory of this is going to be juicy once we finally do find it out. But think about all the changes that they've been making at the heads of the various LVMH brands. I mean, there have been quite a few, obviously not necessarily blood relatives of the owner, but nevertheless, they have shuffled around a lot of folks, just trying to kind of maintain that cachet. Have you ever seen the price of Burley shoes? I don't know what women, I don't even know if they make women's shoes, but I've seen the men's shoes, and yeah, they're pretty pricey.
Yeah, it's not really my speed. I haven't looked at that recently, but
you're
of
just
course,
like $100 Hoka, right?
Yeah, it's $130. It's a Clifton will go for. But of course, you talk about Succession, all the executive reshuffles that they've gone through, but most of the focus is really on Bernard Arnault's children, all 5 of them.
So I wonder, all 5 of them. Well, I wonder where Antoine, or how you pronounce his name, where he's going to end up here. I don't know if this is a breakup or he's just maybe just moving on to greener pastures here. But there was another story that caught my eye, and I've been following this a lot here. A Hall of Notes. I don't know if you know. I think they
You're going to need to hold my hand.
So this is a pop group. They first formed, I think, in the late '60s. They had a string of hits throughout the '70s and '80s. I Can't Go For That, Rich Girl,
I know that
Sarah
one.
Smile, which my mother used to play like on repeat, like during my childhood here. But apparently they have been at odds with each other for several years right now. And there was an interesting story that our producer Aviel Brown flagged to us, saying that Daryl Hall got a restraining order against John Oates.
Oh my gosh, why?
So I guess they're not going to be performing anytime soon.
No, trouble in paradise there. I'm looking through this story. I like this from TMZ. Apparently, Hall disparaged Oates on a podcast last year, saying, "You think John Oates is my partner? He's my business partner. He's not my creative partner."
It's funny too. There was a separate podcast that I heard with Daryl Hall, and it was interesting. They went to do a lot of their history together, and it was very clear in that discussion that he was having. This was with Questlove, the drummer, all about the discord, I guess, that has been between those two men for several years, which is sad. Apparently, they both still tour. They just tour on their own. Yeah. So I don't know how you sing those songs. I guess you can just sing the other guy's verses or what. I don't know how that works here, but I don't know. I mean, it's kind of sad because they were a big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, just iconic. Even their songs today are still get a lot of rotation. I was told that the Gen Zers now have sort of rediscovered Hall of Notes, and
interesting. I guess it skipped over the millennials, but I'm sure I'll see it on TikTok.
The millennials. Anyway, I mean, it's hard to see. You hate to see people break up like that.
It is. It is sad. Hall of Notes.
Hall of Notes. All right, we got to get back to the broader markets here. We are a market show, right?
Theoretically.
Yeah, theoretically here. Yeah. We should point out volume is incredibly light, as is typical heading into the Thanksgiving Day holiday. But stocks are higher on the day, Katie Greifeld, fractionally, but higher.
Still ahead, we're counting it down to the closing bell with Deborah Cunningham, Global Liquidity Market CIO over at Federated Hermes. That conversation coming up next. This is The Close on Bloomberg.
This is the countdown to the close. I'm Romaine Bostick.
And I'm Katie Greifeld.
Stocks are getting a bid here on this Wednesday afternoon. Volume incredibly light, as is typical heading into the Thanksgiving Day holiday on Thursday. You take a look at the board there, fractional gains for the S&P 500. But take a look at some of the individual movers here, because this really was a week about retail. And then you see who the winners have been. At least on today, Burlington Stores up 4%, Amazon up 2%.
Yeah, there you go. So you do have some winners, some interesting movers. Of course, you see some green on the screen there. It's interesting to see that out of Burlington because you think about all the pain for the retailers that we've seen thus far, bucking the trend a little bit.
Microsoft getting its mojo back, and at least 5 of the Magnificent 7 are moving higher on the day, and you flip it up. It's a big part of the reason why the NASDAQ continues to outperform, setting up for what is going to be one of its best years in quite some time here. This is really remarkable. If you came into this year and you thought the NASDAQ 100 was going to be up 40+%, I would have said you were crazy.
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable to think back, even with all the volatility, especially that we saw over the summer months when it came to those big cap tech stocks. Even still, those gains have just been amazing, and the size and scope speaks for itself. A 46% gain that it's sitting on right now, and just a whisper away here from fresh
fresh 52-week highs. Joining us now to help count down to the closing bells, which are just about 8 minutes away, is Deborah Cunningham, Global Liquidity Market CIO over at Federated Hermes. And Deborah, I do want to start off with the big rally that we've seen this year. And I think what everybody really wants to know is whether you find enough evidence to support this rally continuing into 2024.
Well, I'm assuming, Romaine, you're talking about the fixed income market, the bond markets, because that's our wheelhouse. And essentially, the rally that's been going on, it's been volatile and sporadic, but nonetheless, if you drew a straight line through it, you would call it a rally. It's based on, I think, what maybe is a little bit too optimistic of an outlook. That optimistic outlook includes a pretty soft landing. And I'm not saying I'm not in that camp. I don't think we're going into a recession. But I think the bond market has maybe some rose-colored glasses about just how little impact is going to be felt from an economic and a GDP perspective by, interest rates being north of 4 or 5%, depending upon what part of the curve you're in. The other thing I think that the bond market is a little bit too optimistic about is the Fed. I mean, we just had their minutes, released early this week. And, granted that's from a meeting that was, several weeks ago. Yeah. But at that point, the Fed seemed to be determined that if there was a next move, it was going to be an increase, not a decrease. Now, maybe that'll change for the next meeting, but that's where they stand. That's where their speak continues to be, higher for longer. That's
certainly what all the smart people took away, I think, from not only the minutes, but really some of the Fed speak leading up to that. I am curious, though, when you look at the Fed minutes, and for that matter, the Fed statement that we got on the actual day of that, there has been a lot of discussion about some of the language, if you will, that has been removed from some of that commentary, and whether that might be a sign that the Fed is trying to give itself enough wiggle room that if it does feel it needs to go in a different direction, it can.
I don't think that's where it is. I think it's a pat me on the back. I'm doing a good job. I've gotten inflation from 8% down to 4%. But quite frankly, it's going to be a lot more difficult to get inflation from 4% down to 2%, which continues to be their stated target. Now, I don't know. Will they settle if they get everything, sort of in most sectors down into the 3% inflationary environment? Maybe. But again, I don't think that happens overnight. And certainly from a services perspective, that sector of the economy from, with inflation continues to run pretty high. I don't know whether you've done any traveling lately, but I've been in some hotels and airports that are just packed.
And Deborah, when you think about inflation still trying to get down to target, maybe it's going to take longer than maybe the most bullish in the market expect it will. If that means this higher for longer environment actually prevails, what does that mean for demand when it comes to money market funds, in particular, sitting on what, $5.7 trillion? It feels like if you look at the chart, it's just been a straight line up. What actually stops that? How high could that go?
Well, Katie, it's interesting because the last $1 trillion, which has been on a year-to-date basis from, call it 5 to 6 trillion, has come mostly through the retail trade. 85% of that has been retail people coming into the product. And it's because interest rates aren't at zero any longer. They're at 5+% on retail money market funds. What hasn't really started in earnest yet is the institutional movers. And those institutional movers generally wait until interest rates have peaked or plateaued, and then they start to come in. And then they really start to come into the product once interest rates start to go back down again. So quite honestly, I'm looking at 2024 as a pretty banner year. And, another $1 trillion in assets, I think it's quite possible. I mean, the market's fairly evenly split between retail and institutional, yet all flows this year have been driven by retail.
I mean, it's a pretty amazing forecast. Another $1 trillion in money market funds would definitely be a sight to behold. But talk to us a little bit more about the psychology behind that institutional bid. Like you said, they don't typically step in until there's confidence that rates have peaked. What's the logic there? What drives that?
The logic is basically they have the direct security market as another option. So retail trade doesn't have that. Retail is either in bank deposits or in money market funds, and bank deposits have not moved with interest rates. On the other hand, the institutional client can go into the direct market. They can buy repo, they can buy bills, they can buy CDs, they can buy commercial paper directly. And when the Fed is moving, they are more apt to catch up by buying those direct securities a little bit faster. So that's generally where their cash trade goes during an interest rate increasing environment, especially one that started out like we did, last year with 75 basis points at a clip. Now, though, that the, playing field has kind of leveled off, and even if the Fed basically is on hold for a longer period of time, what you essentially see is money market funds with weighted average maturities of 40 and 50 days outperforming that direct market. So the institutional trade now goes into that product.
All right, Deborah, going to have to leave it there. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You do the same. Take care.
Deborah Cunningham over at Federated Hermes, Global Liquidity Market CIO, helping us count down to those closing bells. Just about 2.5 minutes to go here, and stocks right now right around session highs, even though the gains are fractional on the day, 0.4% on the S&P 500.
Yeah, pretty muted overall. And we don't need to tell you again that volume is pretty low today, but some gains on equities, some losses in the bond market. And I'm still thinking about another $1 trillion potentially coming into money market funds.
Into money market funds. When are they coming out of money market funds is what I want to know.
Yeah.
All right. We are moving closer to the closing bell. Stick with us, our full market coverage right here on Bloomberg as we take you to the bell and beyond.
Beyond the Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close starts right now.
And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostick alongside Katie Greifeld. We're counting you down to the closing bell, here to help take us beyond the bell. It's our global simulcast with our friends Carol Massar and Tim Stenovic. Welcome to our audiences across our Bloomberg platforms here on the last full trading day of the holiday shortened week. And this, for our television audience, looked like a very ominous sign. Suddenly, Katie apparently is now the new anchor of all of our shows here on Bloomberg Television. Some technical difficulties as we try to reconnect with Carol and Tim. There they are. There they are. Katie, once again, making it clear here that she plans to take the crown.
Not at all.
As if there's any.
Yeah, who did you pay off for that, Katie?
No, but I'm excited to watch that back later. Me and all my thoughts and all my friends. Carol, how about these markets?
How about these markets? How about this week? What's interesting, though, prior to obviously the explosion at the U.S.-Canadian border, I thought we were going to talk a lot about yields because we did see the yield curve move up again, in particular those two-year yields, topping 4.9% again. And it's interesting, had to do with, some of the data that we got, an increase in consumer year-ahead inflation expectations, those jobless claims numbers. Although digging a little bit deeper, folks are saying that the labor market's getting trickier and trickier for individuals. It's not as tight maybe as it once was, but nonetheless, we did see those yields move up.
What I did find interesting, and we've been covering the explosion throughout the day today, throughout the afternoon, we didn't really see a significant move down in equities as a result of this, Romaine. And perhaps that's because the investors think it's an isolated incident, but sometimes, investors do think that this type of thing can hurt sentiment, and there's always an economic story here.
Yeah, still a lot of details that we don't know, a lot of details that, of course, will determine whether this becomes a market-moving event. At least for today, the market was left to its own devices, higher across the board with more than 387 stocks in the S&P 500 in the green. An 18-point gain for the S&P 500, or about 0.4%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up about 0.5 percentage point. A similar move on a percentage basis for the NASDAQ Composite as well as the NASDAQ 100. And look at this, modest outperformance once again for the Russell 2000, up 0.7%.
Yeah, we just talked with Vance Howard over at Howard Capital Management, and he is really finding some opportunities within the small cap universe. He also thinks that's a pretty positive sign in terms of market sentiment or overall market sentiment and direction, Katie.
The thing about it is, Carol, I mean, you just run a spreadsheet of any of the names in the RTY or any other small and mid-cap indexes, and you can see the value. It's just a matter of your conviction around economic conditions.
But you're starting to see investors, have some conviction with it.
Yeah, we'll see how long that lasts. But let's go now to some of the industry groups. Again, pretty mild day overall, but you do have more green than red up at the top. You have retail, actually, which might seem surprising because we know we've gotten some pretty shaky earnings from the retail subset, but we're talking about eBay, Amazon, Home Depot, et cetera. Then you go down the list to what's not doing so well today. We do have energy, then we have semis and autos bringing up the rear. Autos in particular down about 2.4%.
Yeah, seeing some of those semi names, AMD top in the S&P 500 today. Hey, let's go to some of the individual gainers, if I may. Amazon definitely on the move today at its highs up almost 2.7%, finishing the day just shy of a 2% gain, rallying at the start of the official holiday shopping season. Bloomberg Intelligence out with some research today and saying that Amazon can top $1 trillion in gross merchandise volume in 2026. So they're doing a big outlook here. Despite weaker consumer spending as buy with Prime, third-party merchant gains, and the longer-term shift to digital shopping remain catalysts. And they talk about the expansion of their fulfillment capacity gives it the opportunity to keep growing. Stock up about 75% year to date, and it did hit a 52-week high in today's session. Also top in the NASDAQ 100. Cruise lines. We saw a lot of travel names that were definitely outperforming in today's session. Bringing up the boards, you've got Carnival up almost 2%. You've got Norwegian up about 0.4%, and Royal Caribbean up about 0.1%. They were up a lot more earlier in the session. Had to do with a city call yesterday. They reinstated a buy on Royal Caribbean and Carnival, maintained their neutral on Norwegian. They did raise their price target on Norwegian to 16 from 14. Some other price moves on both Royal and Carnival. So some momentum that they're seeing. The City analyst, and so like that. And just quickly, I want to mention Microsoft, if I may, since that OpenAI story, at least we can shelve it maybe for the day, at least for now. Microsoft up another 1.2%. Many saying it was a significant victory for Microsoft and Satya Nadella, able to reverse that firing.
All right, well, let's go to some of the decliners on the day today. Starting with NVIDIA, on a points basis, the worst performer in the S&P 500 today, despite the fact that for many people, that was a blowout quarter, and the guidance looked pretty good as well. 2.46% is the decline today. Investors not so impressed with the company's latest quarterly report, though it did blow past average analyst estimates. There were some loftier expectations for some investors. Shares, we should note, are up 237% so far this year. So down 2% today, not too big of a deal. Autodesk, the worst performer in the S&P 500 on a percentage basis, falling close to 7% today. It's the most since February. It's the architecture, engineering, construction software company. Yeah, Romaine.
Well, I was going to say, I love this stock. I mean, I feel like it's much more of a proxy for what we're seeing in terms of commercial construction than almost anything else. I mean, really. Because, I mean, that's basically its bread and butter. And if you see those contracts start to fall off, what does that tell you?
But that's the thing. The 2025 fiscal year guidance just came in ever so slightly a bit weak, and this is a pretty big reaction.
Yeah, but look at that backlog. And I always tell people, I remember a couple earnings season, I had this conversation with somebody. If you just run a chart, a Bloomberg chart of the daily stock price, and you overlay that with some of the economic releases on real estate, you'll see just how high the correlation is with this stock and that economic.
So do you think this is more concerning, and this is actually my last decliner, Deere, shares of Deere today falling after the company forecast a smaller than expected profit next year, down 3.1%, Romaine. Oftentimes we look at this as some sort of canary in the coal mine or harbinger of what's to come. There are concerns that farmers are spending less or spending less on upgrading their machinery. Is that a concern to you?
Yeah, I mean, and it shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, did you see what crop prices have done? I mean, we know that correlation is always strong. I mean, the less they get paid for their crops, then it means the less money they have to buy new machinery. I guess the only good thing for Deere is that this all tends to be cyclical. At some point, the farmers are going to need new machinery, and eventually they'll have to buy.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know, but for right now.
When.
But if you're looking in the here and now, and I've always been a big believer in this, we talk about the equity market being kind of a forward pricing mechanism. I always felt like commodity prices, at least at the spot level, are really a reflection of how folks feel about the here and now. Let's check in on yields real quickly. A modest move in yields, higher on the shorter end of the curve, as well as in the belly, about 2 to 3 basis points across those tenors. But interesting to see the longer end of the curve. You're seeing the 30-year yield actually move just ever so slightly lower, and this is really going to be the push and pull here. here is not really just about whether people are buying into the bond market writ large. It's really about the duration and what part of the curve they're finding either something they like or something that they don't like.
Absolutely, you got to pick your spots. And the conversation I've been having about the bond market really for months now is the asymmetry of risk when it comes to duration right now, that if you buy in and rates drop, you're setting up for a pretty nice payday. But you compare that to the risk that yields could go higher, and the losses that you could face there, maybe not as much as when we were closer to some of those depressed levels maybe entering the year.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm thinking already till Friday, right? Black Friday. We're going to be talking, for those of us here, I think all three of us except for Tim are going to be here.
Yeah.
I'll miss you guys.
We're going to be talking a lot about the retail sector, which, you know, if you look at the S&P Super Composite Index, up about 32%. It's not, though, the same story for every retailer. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of movement we potentially get and what kind of clues we get in terms of early shopping this holiday season, whether or not the consumer's out there in full force on Friday.
Yeah, we talked to one analyst yesterday who basically said that she's extremely concerned about the health of the U.S. consumer, and she's seeing it, Romaine, in the lack of hiring when it comes to seasonal workers across different different parts of the retail sector, and she was very bearish.
Down 40%, she said, from the peak in 2021 in terms of hiring.
Yeah, and you don't have to believe her. We saw some of that. I don't know if it's necessarily 40%, but you definitely saw some of that weakness reflected in the last couple of data points that we got in the labor market. I also thought it was interesting, too, when you look at the National Retail Federation. They always put out that number every year about how, and it's always this lofty number. Everything's going to be great. I thought it was interesting. They're basically saying that, they kind of tried to spin it, saying that the actual Black Friday and Cyber Monday is going to be great and it's going to be above trend. But then they kind of slipped in there that the rest of the holiday shopping season is actually going to be below trend here. And I do kind of wonder, I wonder two things. A, if Black Friday even still has the same impact that it used to, given that I was getting Black Friday deals in my email box like a month ago that you could have bought then.
November, right?
Right.
Like,
but also the idea, too, that I don't know if people really feel the need to spend to the same degree this holiday season that maybe they had in the past.
I think everybody's traveling, whether it's domestically or overseas. I think people are,
That's the thing. That's where dollars are being spent. It's on travel. It's not necessarily on items.
And euros, too.
Yeah.
And stuff, right? Everybody's bought every throw pillow they could possibly for their home during the pandemic.
Can never have
You
too
haven't been
many.
in my house. My God. Can I tell you, I came in the other day, I literally on the bed, I think there's like 15 pillows, all new now. Now, keep in mind, I'm only allowed to put my head on one of them. I literally got yelled at because I was laying on one of the pillows, and apparently I'm not supposed to have my dirty head on the pillow, which I thought that's what pillows were for.
She's so right.
We're literally keeping the pillow business in business.
Someone
basically.
needs to. And we
You have a bin for the throw pillows as you take them
And I
off
don't
the
know what
bed.
happens to the old pillows. That's what I know. I just feel like one day I'm just going to like open up a storage unit and it's going to be like, 100 old pillows just going to fall and like knock me in the head.
Got to be careful.
Bottom line,
Anyway, I
no
love
throw
my
pillows.
wife.
We're traveling. All right, guys, have a good and safe Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you guys. All right, that's going to do it. Our cross-platform radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. Everybody's not going to be here tomorrow. Happy Thanksgiving, but some of us will be here on Friday.
And we continue our coverage right here on Bloomberg Television, setting you up with what to expect this holiday shopping season, ostensibly kicking off on this Black Friday. But some consumers have actually decided to skip the event and hold out for bigger discounts. That discussion coming up next on The Close. This is Bloomberg. Another day of gains for U.S. equities. We should point out volume is light heading into the Thanksgiving holiday. But for all those folks that were looking this rally in the mouth and wondering really whether it had legs, take a look at the breadth here. This is the broadening out that we didn't necessarily have earlier this year during the rally. Right now, about more than 85% of the S&P 500 members right now are above that 20-day moving average, and quite a few right now are approaching that 50-day moving average as well. This is that breadth that a lot of folks wanted to see to provide, I guess, some ratification that this rally had, I guess, something more to it than just, well, Microsoft, Nvidia, and the rest of the Magnificent Seven. The NASDAQ 100 up about 0.4% here on the day. The Russell 2000 also participating in it. So you got the big cap names and you got the small cap names all continuing this push higher. Meanwhile, the VIX is tamped down back below 13. The joke that Katie Greifeld made just yesterday here is that we could see this in the double digits and in the single digits, and that might not actually be a joke. The yields are basically in safe stasis mode right now. A bit of a tick up here on this day, but nothing really to get too worked up about. I do want to take a look here at gas prices. This is the holiday travel season here in the United States, where folks take to the skies as well as in their cars. And the good news is, well, gas prices are down. $3.28 roughly is basically the average price that you're paying at the pump. And as you can see here, that's well below where we were back a year ago on Thanksgiving when we were approaching $4. And as you can see, earlier this year when we were above $5.
Let's turn back to one of the big stories of this week, and that, of course, is Binance CEO Changpeng Zhao pleading guilty to anti-money laundering and U.S. sanctions violations under a sweeping settlement with the U.S. that allows the crypto exchange to continue operating. Bloomberg opinion columnist Aaron Brown says that he sees, quote, a major risk that the deal itself, as well as the strengthened controls it will require, will taint Binance among many of its customers, especially outside the U.S. I'm thrilled to say that Aaron Brown, he joins us now. And Aaron, I thought this was interesting because we've been talking a lot about the man himself, CZ, but what could the potential future for Binance look like here?
Well, I've been looking very hard at this for both personal investment reasons as well as kind of general news. I think it could be a big deal. I think the external customers outside the U.S. Don't like the U.S. sanctions and not the U.S. rules. And that's one of the reasons they went to Binance instead of, say, Coinbase or Gemini. And within the U.S., there's a lot of competition of regulated exchanges. Binance does have some strengths, like its trading of derivatives, but I'm not sure how. Well, I certainly would not expect it to remain the largest crypto exchange under the settlement.
Aaron, that is so interesting because if not Binance, I mean, who are we talking about? We know that Coinbase is big in the U.S. When it comes to international markets, though, not so much of a presence.
Yeah, that's true. So in the U.S., many people prefer, especially most institutions, prefer the regulated exchanges, which Binance is now apparently going to join. Outside the U.S., many investors have preferences for exchanges that don't follow those rules. And I'm not just talking about terrorists and criminals and money launderers here. There's a lot of reasons why it could be a pain in the neck to deal with U.S. regulations. And there are some very well-known, successful non-U.S. exchanges that people can go to if they don't want U.S. regulated exchange.
But this gets to this idea, Aaron, and you mentioned this in your column, the idea that kind of we could see this divergence or divorcing, I think it was the language you used, of the traditional finance world and the crypto and digital finance world. But I guess the question is, I felt like to a certain extent, both worlds were sort of chasing after each other. The traditional finance folks, they looked at the sexiness going on in crypto, and the crypto folks looked at the legitimacy that the traditional finance folks had, and they wanted a piece of that. You're saying that that's over?
No, there are still people who want that. And in fact, this settlement may make it easier for them. But there are people in crypto who feel that the traditional financial system is just corrupting and holding crypto back. And plenty of people in traditional finance who think crypto is a scam and a tool for criminals.
Is the trust there, though? I mean, because, let's face it. When I go down, my paycheck gets deposited into a bank or I make any other transaction with a major financial institution, I have zero worries that I'm going to get my money whenever I need it here. Is that trust there when it comes to the crypto space or digital currencies overall?
Well, with all due respect, I think you may have too much trust in the traditional financial system.
Yeah, after what happened with SVB,
was introduced in 2008 when a lot of people had lost that trust. I think you are speaking like a law-compliant U.S. citizen here, I assume. I'm just guessing here.
I'm going to take that as a compliment, but thank you.
If you lived in Argentina, if you lived in Gaza, if you lived in Iran or something, you might have a very different view of which is actually safer. In theory, crypto offers you cryptographic proofs. You don't have to trust anybody. In practice, most people in crypto are dealing with Binance or Coinbase or somebody. Now, Coinbase, you have to completely trust them. You give your money to Coinbase, they hold it for you, and they just tell you they'll give it back if you want it. Binance, one of the other advantages it has, and one reason it might succeed, is it has the Binance custody where your money is actually safe, segregated from the exchange. So unlike FTX, unlike Coinbase, you have some crypto security. Crypto people feel that, crypto security is better, that governments are inherently untrustworthy. If they don't steal your money, they'll inflate it away, or they'll have a financial crisis and you'll lose it. Better to have a cryptographic proof that nobody can violate. Most people disagree. Most people, like you, feel more safe with their direct deposit in their bank.
Well, Aaron, I mean, just zooming out a little bit, you mentioned that what we're seeing with Binance and the potential fallout from this deal could benefit another exchange. But if you think existentially, why should this benefit any exchange? I mean, couldn't you see some of these crypto people just take their money off exchanges altogether and maybe go into cold wallets, et cetera, versus actually going through an exchange at all?
Well, I've always done that, so it's easy for me to say. Yes, I think that's true. I think that this settlement will encourage people, not necessarily, you don't have to go all the way to, becoming a crypto programmer and having a cold wallet. You can use trustworthy custody arrangements or things like that. I think that the credit of exchanges has to clean up. And whether it's done by the SEC forcing people to do that, or just customers realizing that there's a lot of crypto people some of whom are crooks, some of whom are, delusional optimists, and you just can't trust your money to them.
All right, Aaron, it's always great to talk to you. Your columns are always a treat and always gives me great insights. Aaron Brown, have a wonderful weekend. Bloomberg opinion columnist and, of course, ran the financial market research over at AQR before coming to illustrious Bloomberg. All right, stick with us. Coming up here after the break, we're going to go back up to the Canadian border and check in on the latest developments about that incident we learned about just about 3 hours ago, the explosion on the Rainbow Bridge connecting the U.S. and Canada. This is Bloomberg.
This is obviously a very serious situation in Niagara Falls. There was a vehicle explosion at the Rainbow Bridge crossing. I've been briefed by the NSIA and the Minister of Public Safety. CBSA, RCMP, and Transport Canada are all fully engaged in providing the necessary support. There are a lot of questions, and we are following up to try and get as many answers as rapidly as possible. We are in close contact with U.S. officials, and we'll continue to work closely with them.
The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking earlier about the vehicle explosion on the Rainbow Bridge, which connects the U.S. to Canada at Niagara Falls. We've heard from other officials in Canada as well as in the U.S., all confirming the explosion took place, but being very clear not to ascribe any sort of motive yet for exactly what happened and why. Those developments and that investigation still underway and raising a lot of questions right now about security at the nation's borders and elsewhere ahead of the holiday travel season. Joining us right now to talk a little bit more about this is Laura Dillon-Kane. She is our bureau chief at our Ottawa bureau in Ottawa, Canada, obviously. Laura, let's start off here. The last time we spoke, we know that most of the road crossings connecting the U.S. and Canada in that Niagara region had been shut down. I think after we spoke to you, we did learn that the airport on the U.S. side in Buffalo, New York, had also had grounded all incoming and outbound flights. Are there any other additional security measures that have been taken that restrict any sort of movement of folks either in Canada or in the U.S.?
Right. So we reached out to the Greater Toronto Airport Authority, which controls Pearson Airport, which is the country's largest air travel hub in Toronto. And they said they have asked for additional police to secure the site and to monitor the site, not due to any specific threat, but just out of an abundance of caution. There are no plans at this time to shut down that airport, but it is a fluid situation, and they said they would, keep us posted. The Toronto police have also stepped up their presence just in the streets of Toronto. Just again, not out of any specific concern or threat, but just out of an abundance of caution. So a lot of Canadian cities and areas in Ontario are sort of bracing and trying to ensure that they have security after this incident, which is still raising a lot of questions. As you said, it has not been confirmed to be an act of terrorism. We don't really know the motive just yet, but It is being treated as though it was intentional unless proven otherwise. So everybody is in a state of high alert, and the Prime Minister, has described it as a very serious incident, one that he is coordinating closely with American authorities on, and that he will be sort of seized with this issue for the rest of the day in briefings with American and Canadian intelligence sources. So this is an extremely serious incident, and we are seeing more and more sort of impacts of it at airports and cities and border crossings.
Okay, so to go back to the actual Niagara border crossings, the road crossings, the Rainbow Bridge, Peace Bridge, and some of the others, can you just give us a sense here as to how much those bridges, those crossings are used? Let's start with the Rainbow Bridge, because I'm under the understanding that's primarily passenger car traffic that is allowed to use that bridge, correct?
That's right. And, it is one that is very, often used, particularly this time of year. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving, and there are a lot of sort of holidays being taken, even on the Canadian side as well as the U.S. side. So there were a lot of passengers going back and forth. So these closures at that particular border crossing and at other border crossings in the area are going to cause significant impacts. Borders in other places across Canada are going to start to pile up with lots of cars waiting to cross through. And so, it's a significant one, particularly because of the Niagara Falls tourist area as well. So it's going to have an impact for sure. And there is no plan that we know of yet for a sort of a timeline for when it could reopen. As this investigation unfolds, it may not be anytime soon. So these impacts to traffic will be significant and could have economic impacts as well.
And Laura, you had mentioned that, of course, the two sides are speaking together. They're both the FBI and Canadian authorities investigating this vehicle explosion. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that communication looks like, this coordination among these different authorities in different countries?
Right. The public safety minister in Canada said that he had been in close contact with the American side, speaking with the director or the Homeland Security Secretary, and that American officials and Canadian officials were coordinating closely. So it is sort of minute by minute they are getting updates, and we still aren't getting a lot of public information because of that, because there is so much contradictory information, as the public safety minister has said. They're sort of locked in briefings on this, and so we are still waiting to hear a lot of very concrete details. But certainly the U.S. officials and the Canadian officials are working extremely closely on this matter, because as the public safety minister said, this was a violent incident at a border crossing, which is an area of significant national interest for both the Canada and U.S. government. So it's essentially, a violent incident on a piece of shared infrastructure. And so that's a cause for deep concern among Canadian and U.S. officials.
All right, Laura Dillon Kane, who runs our Bloomberg Bureau in Ottawa, going to say goodbye to her. And as she just reiterated, there are still a lot of details that we don't know. What we know, we've told you. Stick with us. We'll be back in a moment. This is Bloomberg. Here we are on this Wednesday afternoon. This is the last full trading day of this holiday shortened week. And if you had any doubts about this rally, you take a look at some of the price action. Volume, yes, is light here, but the uptrend has certainly been solidified to a certain extent, with the S&P 500 adding to the gains that it's had in the month of November, 0.4% on the day. That may not be much, but that takes it now to roughly about a 9% gain so far this month, which, if that holds through next week, would actually be the best monthly performance for the S&P 500 in more than a year. Similar moves for the NASDAQ, similar moves for the Russell 2000 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average as well. And that's raising a lot of questions right now about how much more room this rally has to go and what exactly will support it. Is it going to be what we're seeing in Treasury yields, which have been tamped down? Is it what we're going to see with the dollar, which has also been tamped down? And is it what we're going to see in the commodity space? Prices there also, too, have been tamped down. Earnings season is behind us, and now all eyes are looking forward to the holiday shopping season here in the U.S. and that next big Fed meeting, which is just a couple of weeks away. Katie?
Well, when it comes to the shopping season ahead of us, Bain Co. has released a study of 23,000 consumers in 11 countries to better understand their beliefs and their attitudes about sustainability and how that impacts shopping behaviors. 64% reported high levels of concern about sustainability, and they're willing to pay a premium for sustainable products, while also saying that those products are still priced too high. Joining us now to break it down is Leah Johns. She is Global Consumer Lab Director at Bain Co. Leah, it's great to have you with us. And let's start with those high level of concerns. What's interesting about this study is that it's global in nature. Where is that concern most prevalent?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So potentially counterintuitively, we actually see highest levels of concern in fast-growing markets. I would just say the global concern, as you mentioned, 64% of consumers is largely driven by extreme weather events. And so we felt extreme weather events all over the world, but actually in fast-growing markets, when we dig into why they are so worried, it's personal impact of those extreme weather events and other environmental issues such as pollution or water quality. So that's what we're really seeing in terms of differences around the world.
Yeah, it's a great point that maybe when it's at your door, you're a little bit more concerned and more willing to buy those sustainable products. But let's talk about pricing here. Some really interesting numbers that, again, consumers willing to pay a premium but think it's too high. What specifics did you find around that impulse?
Yeah, so pricing is a question that a lot of our clients ask us. So are consumers willing to pay? And it was one of the key questions we really wanted to dig into. We also understand that it lends itself to what we call sometimes a say-do gap. So people say one thing, believe one thing, and then ultimately end up doing something else. So pricing is interesting because in the US, on average, Americans say that they're willing to pay an 11% price premium for a sustainable product. If you look at what the market actually has on offer, it's double that. It's over double that. It's 28% premium. So there's a huge gap already in terms of what consumers say that they're willing to pay for and then what's available. The other thing, a piece of the puzzle that I think is important to know is that sustainability doesn't come in a vacuum. And so consumers have associations with sustainability. They associate it with health and they associate it with quality. And those are two attributes that consumers are willing to pay for. So what's important for companies to know is if they make a greener and more expensive product that's identical, it's probably not going to win with consumers. But if they make a product that is greener and healthier, or greener and higher quality, or better yet, greener and more affordable, that's where you're really going to see traction with consumers.
I am curious. I mean, we were looking at the data a little bit earlier, and one number jumped out, and that was, I think it was a 98% or something, or 96% of folks in this survey basically saying that, yeah, they're acknowledging climate change. And a lot of us said, really? Not like that many? I mean, I don't know. I mean, if I lined up 10 of my friends, I think 5 of them would tell you that it's all a hoax. So I am curious as to how you got there. What was the methodology behind it?
Yep. So the question that we asked was, do you think the climate has something to do with human impact or changing the environment has to do with human impact? And of our respondents, it was a really high percent. Now, that said, we did look along all sorts of demographic lines. So age, income, political leaning. Interestingly, globally, there isn't a huge difference when it comes to political leaning. In the US, I know that it is a politicized issue. But what's interesting is even though liberals reported a higher level of worry, up to 40% of conservatives or close to 40% of conservatives also said that they were very concerned with climate change. Now, what I think would be really interesting and related to your question is when you remove that word, climate change, it becomes much less politicized. And we really don't see a difference when it comes to deforestation, when it comes to air pollution, for example. So it's really that word that we find to be quite political.
And this brings me to my other question, though, too. And it's also about how these companies approach this. As I'm sure you know, it's always a delicate thing for a company to say, we're making this product or service specifically with the environment in mind or some other social issue here. Because for all the people that are going to be intrigued by that, there are just as many people that are going to be outraged by that and try to push back. And we've seen this with Target and quite a few other companies that have really felt the wrath, maybe of a minority of people, but a very vocal minority of people.
Yeah, I mean, we know that greenwashing is a huge concern and it's on the rise. And we asked part of this in our survey. We said, you know, what do you trust large corporations to sell you truly sustainable products? And only 28% of consumers said that they did. Now compare that to close to half of consumers that said they trusted independent local businesses. And the reason for that was transparency. And so I think it's a huge lesson for companies that to be transparent around what's going on in the background, around the policies that you're putting in place, but also the role that you have and responsibility in, contributing to where we are today. So I think you're right, but I think that when we talk to executives, this is an issue that is not going to go away. It's already affecting their business, and so they need to address them, and then they need to really do in-market testing to understand what messages resonate with consumers and which don't.
And Leah, we're talking about consumer behavior here, which of course is informed by personal beliefs, political leanings, as we just discussed. But talk to us about what role government regulation plays in sort of informing consumer behavior.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I think that at least a lot of executives that we speak to have a belief that maybe consumer behavior doesn't shift, or it shifts really slowly. And when we actually look at regulation, and there's examples of this. So in the UK, when they started charging for single-use plastic bags at the grocery store, in 2015, when that happened, it's been reduced from 98%. You look at China and their electric vehicle due to tax incentives. And so consumers do change if they're nudged and if regulation plays a role there. And so when we talk to companies, we say, consumer behavior can change with nudges and regulation, but it's also important for companies to get ahead of regulation and be part of that, because it ultimately will be a competitive advantage for them as well.
All right, Leah, love your insights, and I just got to say it, I love those glasses.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful Thanksgiving if you celebrate that over there. Leah Johns, Global Consumer Lab Director over at Bain & Company, taking a closer look at some of the consumer shopping trends. And you want to dive a little bit deeper into that because we've already apparently gotten data on the holiday spending, at least the early holiday spending, and apparently it's already outpacing projections. This is according to Adobe Analytics. Abigail Doolittle stopping by the program to kind of walk us through this. And I first got to start off, Abigail. Early holiday, so I figured, I thought the holiday shopping season actually started Friday, but apparently Adobe says this actually started a few weeks ago.
I'm so glad you're bringing up that. That was the first point that I had too, that we have 20 days worth of holiday shopping. When did the holiday start? November 1st as opposed to Black Friday. But yes, that is the case. So we're completely in line there. So yes, 5% up over 2022. They were expecting up 4.8%, a total of $63.2 billion. I think that the big
these are just online sales, which
just online,
okay.
yes. And I think that the big takeaway is that they're saying that the consumer is strong, quote unquote, willing to spend despite rising interest rates, having to repay student debt. They're also saying demand is the driver and not price increases. I don't even know how they look into that, maybe the data that they collect from online. But yes, they're saying that it's strong demand and they expect it. So the traditional holiday season, at least what we were thinking about, starts actually not even on Black Friday. It starts tomorrow, but they're expecting that Cyber Week to be strong too for another $37.2 billion, 5.4% increase.
What is Cyber Week? I'm sorry.
I had to look into it myself. So it starts tomorrow, Thanksgiving, and then it's Black Friday, which is supposed to be $9.6 billion, the weekend, and then Cyber Monday. It's a whole definition.
It's too many definitions here.
I need to totally rework my calendar, but looking at these spending forecasts.
Don't rework your calendar.
I need to know. I need to know what these definitions are. But looking at the spending forecast, it's interesting that the most growth has been Cyber Monday. And of course, Cyber Week overwhelms on the total figures here. But when you look at just Black Friday and Cyber Monday, we spend so much time talking about Black Friday, but it's Cyber Monday that has the most dollars attached and the most growth.
It is pretty interesting to see that shift, and I'm not sure what that attributes to, if it's the FOMO, the fear of missing out. It also could be, so there's different reports here. I think that what really makes this interesting is, so you have Adobe Analytics saying that online is strong. You also have the National Retail Federation having similar growth numbers for both online and traditional. But then these companies, they're talking about consumer demand not being so great. Also the idea that consumers may hold back looking for the best price. So I don't know if Cyber Monday will be as strong as they're expecting.
I got to tell you anecdotally, not to make this all about me, but I know I've been getting these offers for the Black Friday, and then you see like 20, 30% off, and you're like,
it pays to wait.
But I'm like, I'm not 20, 30% off. I don't get out of bed for that. So there is maybe a wait and see. One interesting thing in this report that I want to get to before we let you go here, they talked about some of the some of the categories that they're seeing a lot of activity. Some of them are obvious, obviously a lot of toys and things like that. Barbie is popular as well, but they also had card games.
I saw that.
Yeah.
Marshmallows or something?
Yeah.
Oh, the squishy thing.
Squishy thing.
Squishmallows.
Yeah.
I love those.
You love those?
I got one
Okay,
for my
well, we know what to
cat.
get Katie for Christmas. Pajamas.
Yes.
Cosmetics, which makes sense. Headphones. and sweaters.
But you know what they also brought up? The fact they're saying that appliances are strong. We've had a couple retailers, Lowe's, Best Buy, and Home Depot saying the opposite. So are people now buying appliances online?
I don't know. How would you feel if somebody gifted you just
like a refrigerator?
A refrigerator?
I would take a toaster, actually. A beautiful new stainless toaster. I'm in.
I guess it depends on from who. I don't
Oh, yeah.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
A toaster.
Right. If it was like a stranger, that'd be a little awkward,
I don't
right?
think I'm going to put this in my
I guess if it's from, your parents or your spouse or something, but I don't know. That seems so impersonal.
If my husband bought me a toaster,
yeah.
I would not be happy.
Okay, well,
Mr.
Greifeld, if you're watching, I think
you
you have your marching orders. All right, our thanks there to Abigail. To a closer look here at the holiday shopping season, which, according to Adobe, started 20 days ago. All right, we're going to stay on this topic of the consumer and the expectations for the holiday shopping season. National Director of Retail Service at Colliers is going to be joining us after the break. This is Bloomberg. All right, this week does mark what traditionally is the beginning of the holiday shopping season, and retailers across the U.S., they're bracing for a much more challenging time, with some consumers holding out on Black Friday shopping, waiting for bigger discounts. Consumer demand is becoming a lot more difficult to predict. Anjee Solanki joining us right now, National Director of Retail Services and Practice Groups over at Colliers. And we were speaking with our colleague right before you, Anjee, and I thought it was kind of funny. She was pointing out some data from Adobe, which basically said the holiday shopping season started 20 days ago. And I sort of chuckled at that. What I didn't tell her is I've actually done some of my holiday shopping already, and I am curious about this sort of creep where we're sort of getting inundated with these offers much earlier than we normally did, and whether that's kind of taking some of the magic out of Black Friday.
It sure is. I have to say, we're calling it Blur Friday because everything's blurring together. And what we're really noticing here is that it's being pulled forward. The spend is being pulled forward. We're seeing it much earlier in the summer, actually. Discounts and promotions have started. And we're looking at possibly, 52% of consumers looking at not shopping on Black Friday and skipping it altogether because there could be better deals out there on Cyber Monday or even soon after that. So as you stated, Christmas is creeping up earlier, and so is Black Friday.
I'm curious then, what does this do for the retailers themselves? Because I feel like the traditional Black Friday season, at least, for those of us of a certain age, it was relatively predictable before the age of e-commerce and before the pull forward in all these deals here. It has to be much harder to sort of plan your inventory and plan your pricing when you don't really know when those folks are going to walk in the door or come to your website.
100%. But I think there's now more technology and there's more ability to actually look at and understand buying habits, trends, what are people really focused on certain different times of the year. And so having that data and historical data going back, it really allows that retailer to look at their spending habits and then actually how they can focus on what people are looking for specifically during various times, the holidays, for the entire Cyber Week, et cetera.
And Anjee, you have some great notes in here about how else retailers are preparing for this upcoming holiday season, sort of relaxing some of those return windows, other policies that maybe they're changing to maybe get people in the door. Walk us through that a little bit and what that's in response to, what that says about the consumer right now.
Definitely. I think, look, people have so many different ways and conveniences of shopping, different channels, as I describe it. And so when you think about it, you look at, there's online, there's also, the in-store. But if you're purchasing something online and returning it into the store, you want to have that same convenience where the retailer says, okay, we're going to actually say, as part of this, either we're going to provide you with a gift card or we're going to provide you with a store credit. Now, getting a gift card or a store credit, in my opinion, is a great idea or an incentive by the retailer. And the reason why is you're going to come back to that store to make that purchase. And during that time, you may end up getting a second purchase out of it as a retailer. So having that kind of return policy where it's pulling that consumer or that customer back into the store to make that second purchase at a later date is actually a benefit.
It makes sense too, right? I mean, if you get store credit, you're really locked within the system. You have to spend that money at that store. I mean, is that becoming the norm when you think about some of these return policies? Store credit, gift cards, rather than actual cash, which maybe some people want?
Yeah, it definitely is because they have the ability to start seeing, again, going back to technology and the shopping behaviors, they're able to actually pull that data and they can start to see either trends that occur. If that person has a high propensity to order online, return in store, receive a gift card or a credit, how are they utilizing that gift card? How are they using that store credit? They actually get that data and they're able to take that information and see how they can, prolong it. I mean, it's amazing to see. I don't know about you, but I've actually, call it secret shopped on with promotions. And there's two retailers, I won't name who they are, but I get at least 3 emails a day from a certain retailer giving me, hey, you forgot that in your bag. Hey, I saw you looking at that product. Hey, don't forget, there's a 60% discount on its way. And if you wait a little longer, you might even get additional discounts. Whereas another retailer is basically saying, look at all these great products that we're offering versus not, and there's no discounts whatsoever. And I find it really interesting. I end up actually spending a little bit more with the retailer that isn't giving me a discount or a promotion.
That's interesting. Yeah, I kind of wait for those emails. I've kind of learned that game. You just kind of put everything in your basket and then just click away, and then you wait, 24 hours, and it's always that little 15, 20% coupon that they give you. I am curious though too, and I mean, you kind of touched on this, but also, I mean, some of these companies that kind of have these membership programs, and some are more aggressive with that. I think RH has gone almost completely membership right now. And then you have other companies like Best Buy, which have tried to move into that space as well. I mean, how effective is that as a mechanism to retain customers?
I mean, it's really great if they see a benefit from that or a value. If your, call it membership is $100 a year or $60 a year, but you're seeing maybe 150 to 200 times that in actual benefits or promotions, it's valuable to that individual or that family that tends to shop there on a pretty regular basis. Now, really what starts to happen is when you're looking at this and you start to subscribe to too many, I kind of use the analogy of, your TV programs, and you have Netflix, you have Prime, you have a whole host of different, TV subscriptions. This, hopefully it doesn't get to that where we have so many and we start to forget which ones we have, and it just becomes an annual subscription. But, there is a benefit if there is truly a value tied to that membership.
Well, I mean, to that point, it could easily become like one of those many subscriptions that you have that you keep paying that maybe you forgot about a while ago. But how hard are retailers actually pushing those types of programs?
There are certain few, right? So you have, for example, Walmart definitely does. IKEA, although theirs is a free membership, really is encouraging that. That could be potentially leading to a paid subscription over time. But I think retailers are leaning into this because they're starting to see that there could be a value proposition here that allows their customers or their consumers to look at different products in different ways to find those additional savings. And it's almost as though, when you're getting the, Best Buy is another one that does it. But as you may recall, when we had the Bed Bath & Beyonds and we were getting those coupons, it was definitely, my car was stacked with the coupons, listed pretty high here. And I was just grabbing and going into the store and I'd be able to get some additional discount. It's feel good. So I think it's really more from that psychological play is like, okay, I'm getting a membership, but I'm also getting these deeper discounts.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see how things shake out here. I guess everyone's different. Everyone has their preferences, and I guess that's the beauty of what's going on out there. Anjee, this was a great conversation. Great to catch up with you. Anjee Solanki, she's National Director of Retail Services and Practice Groups over at Colliers. A closer look here at the holiday shopping season. Stick with us. We're going to set you up for what to watch over the next couple of days. This is Bloomberg. As we close out the close on this Wednesday afternoon, let's push ahead to what's taking place over the next couple of days. It could be market moving. Of course, tomorrow, Thursday, the Thanksgiving Day holiday here in the U.S., so markets will be closed.
Yeah, blissfully, markets closed tomorrow. They will be open kind of on Friday, just for a little bit. Of course, we think about 1 p.m. for the equity markets closed, and then the bond market coming at 2 p.m. on Friday.
Absolutely. And of course, we will have full coverage. The close will air at a special time from 12 p.m. until 2 p.m. New York time, and a big discussion about Black Friday and retail sales.
And we do have a Macy's CEO interview taking place earlier in the day. Of course, we'll bring you that. That'll be interesting. We do have data to look forward to as well, some PMIs coming up from the U.S. and the Euro area.
And we're also going to hear about the EU-Canada summit. The president of the European Council, Charles Michel, together with the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, will be traveling to Canada for those discussions. We'll have full coverage of that as well. We really appreciate you being with us today. Katie and I will be back on Friday. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. This is Bloomberg.